Hello everyone, today I want to talk about Canadian Highlander archetypes. Canadian Highlander is my favorite format of Magic. 100 card singleton, no ban lists. There's a points list, 1v1. It's just one of the best ways to play powerful Magic in my opinion. And I wanted to create this video as a resource for new players so that they can have a bunch of lists to poach from. They can sort of get an understanding of what archetypes look like in the context of a 100 card singleton with a vintage, vintage card pool, and also just sort of see how Canadian Highlander is sort of a brewer's paradise that you can do a lot in, and that, here are some things to sort of give inspiration for newcomers to the format. This video is going to be really long, and I'm going to be recording it in multiple parts, so if the audio changes, that's probably why, because it was a different recording session. I will be putting timestamps in the video description so that you can jump around if you need to. So without further ado, let's sort of get into things. The agenda for the video is I'm first going to talk about the context of Canadian Highlander and how this changes sort of deck building heuristics and metagame evaluation, so to speak. It's difficult to look at decks just in a vacuum. You got to kind of see what they're facing against, because even though you can do basically anything in Canadian Highlander, some things are obviously more powerful than others. Then I want to sort of talk about the broad super-archetypes that I'm going to be covering. Those are things like aggro, fast combo, etc. Then I want to talk about tiers in the context of Canadian Highlander, and honestly why tiers don't really matter that much in Canadian Highlander as opposed to other constructed formats like Legacy, Vintage, Modern. Then I'm going to show off a bunch of lists. I'm going to cover a bunch of lists. That'll be the longest part of this video. And then I'm going to do a wrap-up and have a bunch of resources that you guys can use for seeing all the decks that I'm going to talk about in this video. So, for context, Canadian Highlander is a 100-card singleton format. That means that except for basic lands and cards that specifically let you have multiples of them in your deck, such as Dragon's Approach, I guess is an example, Relentless Rats, everything is singleton. So 100-card singleton creates really high variance, and what this means is that you should look at it as it makes consistency a puzzle that you're trying to solve. You're playing it with variance. Variance makes it so that games don't always look the same, but your goal is to try to make your deck still function in similar ways every game, and that's sort of kind of the fun of the format as opposed to having easy access to the best cards for each slot. This does make building around synergy pieces and combo pieces a lot more difficult because you don't get 4 copies. So finding synergy pieces or combo pieces requires the use of a lot of tutor cards. So things like Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, etc. Decks also tend to gravitate towards good stuff to fill out slots. And this is true in a lot of other formats, but in a lot of other formats you have very well-defined best threats, and you can just play 4-ofs of all of them. Because you have a 100-card singleton, if you want to play like a mid-range deck and fill out your slots, you have to dig a lot deeper. This means that mana curves tend to be a lot less homogenized. Even aggro decks go up to like 3 or 4 mana. Counter spells that go from 1 mana to 2 mana, sometimes you'll see like even a 4 mana counter spell like Cryptic Command. It's just the mana curves of the format are a lot more spread out than in other formats where you get to run, obviously, all of the 4 copies of all the best forms of interaction, forms of creatures, etc. This makes things like Chalice of the Void a lot less powerful, Lavinia a lot less powerful, Sanctum Prelate if you were thinking of like Legacy, Death and Taxes sideboard tech. Speaking of sideboards, we don't have sideboards, companions, or wish boards. This means that you don't get extra slots for tech pieces, you don't get a free starting card, and you don't get an extra slots for tutoring pieces. If you find all of your cards, honestly. This means that playing cards that are narrow comes at a cost. If you play a card that only hates on artifacts and then play against a deck that doesn't have any artifacts in it, that card's not very good. This makes things like Force of Vigor, which is a really strong card in something like Vintage, basically not playable in Canadian Highlander, because if you play against a creature deck and you have a Force of Vigor in hand, it looks really bad. This also means that cards which are modal or flexible have a lot higher value to an extent, because a lot of the more flexible and modal cards are more expensive, and Canadian Highlander still is a very fast format. I would say that if you aren't doing something powerful or interacting with your opponent by turn 4, it's probably not a good sign. So things like Kolaghan's Command are very flexible, but they're expensive. But things like Prismatic Ending or March of Otherworldly Light, which are a little more on rate, so to speak, are really flexible, which gives them a lot better, it just gives them a lot more viability. In addition, when you're metagaming, if you're playing in a group or in a store and you're metagaming, most of your metagame choices tend to be centered around what deck you choose and less about the individual cards. This sort of ties back into the 100-card singleton with variants. If you include, a specific hate piece like Rest in Peace, because your meta has a lot of graveyard decks, you're probably less likely to find Rest in Peace, unless you have a lot of tutors to find it, than you are just playing a deck that is good against the graveyard decks. Just as an example. Finally, there's no banned list. So instead of a banned list, there are pointed cards. And these pointed cards are some of the most powerful cards that are in Magic. Things like Black Lotus, Time Walk, Ancestral Recall, and even some newer cards like Fourth Aerolingus, Thassa's Oracle, Underworld Breach. I mean, Thassa's Oracle and Underworld Breach are like 4 years old at this point, but they're still relatively new compared to the original Moxen. And these pointed cards tend to act as either very high variance spikes in a deck, or they're key deck pieces. So a lot of very powerful combo pieces are points. So if you're playing a combo deck that uses that combo, obviously you're spending your points on those cards. This is a 10-point format, so something like Black Lotus is 7 points. Something like Mana Vault is only 1 point. This does mean that basically anything is playable, because nothing is ever banned out of the format. Your deck will never just be completely unplayable because someone made a ban, the ban list changed. But decks do wax and wane in power as access to their pointed cards change. So if you're on like the Discord or talking with people in your local metagame and people say, well, this deck is not doing so well, or this deck got a point, usually when decks gain points, they gain power because the pointed cards are extremely powerful. There are more variance spikes in the deck. If a deck loses points, usually it makes the deck less consistent or less likely to pop off. This does also mean, though, that combined with the inherent variance with 100-card singleton, decks that are unfavored in a matchup are still perfectly capable of taking games and even taking down events just by running really well. So even though there is sort of a known hierarchy of decks, decks that are known to perform better than others, that doesn't mean that your favorite brew or whatever can't take down an event. In fact, it's probably more likely to take down an event in Canadian Highlander than it is in something like Modern or Legacy. Moving on to the broad super-archetypes, I've classified them as basically 6 main archetypes. There's the aggro decks, and the proactive midrange decks are sort of the same thing. These are decks like Red Deck Wins, Death and Taxes, Gruul Monsters, basically anything which tends to use fast mana or strip mine as points, and is looking to be the aggressor in basically every matchup. These decks usually, if they have disruption at all, they're tied to creatures, such as, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Hate Bear type pieces. Sometimes they'll run like things like Collector Oof, for example. Even though it's not purely aggressive, it still can turn sideways. The next category are the reactive fair blue decks, and these decks tend to use blue draw spells as points. So the big one is Ancestral Recall, but they'll use things like Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time. Sometimes they'll use Mystical Tutor to set up things like Terminus, and their main game plan is to control the game with 1-for-1 removal and then win through card advantage, which is why most of their points tend to go towards blue draw spells. Then there's what I call fast combo decks, and these are combo decks that are generally spell-based, spell or artifact-based, and they use combo pieces and tutors as their points. Decks that fall into this category would be something like Reanimator, Doomsday, Time Vault, Paradox Academy, Flash Hulk, things that are not really looking to play fair games and just looking to win with a combo. Sometimes they'll have various levels of backup plans, but they are capable of winning as early as turn 1, 2, 3. The next category is creature combo. Creature combo is generally a lot slower than the spell-based combo decks because they tend to require a lot more resources, whether it's a lot of creatures on board, a lot of mana, they have to get through summoning sickness, whatever. But the strength of creature combo is that they get to play a mid-range game that gets transitioned into the combo. A deck that's not really in this format, but is in something like Modern would be Yawgmoth. That's sort of a creature combo deck. It can still beat down with its creatures, but also has a combo finish. In this format, you'd see things like Kiki-Pod, Seekerwalk, Pattern Rector. Those are sort of creature combo decks. Even Cradlehoof, which is sort of like Elves. It's like a natural order Elves deck for Cradlehoof Behemoth. The fifth category is the non-blue mid-range decks and synergy decks. Mid-range is such a hard term because in a lot of other formats, mid-range means that they play the best creatures along the curve and are not focused specifically on like 1s and 2s, etc. In Canlander, every deck has to play like that, so mid-range gets kind of muddied. But these decks are decks that are not purely proactive like the aggro decks. They're not just trying to go as fast as possible, but they can't lean on counter spells because they're not blue. These ones will be things like 3-color Hate Bear decks, or black-red mid-range decks, or Jund, and synergy decks such as Aristocrats or Artifact Welder decks. These decks are not necessarily looking to control the game like fair blue decks are, like the reactive fair blue decks are, but they are looking to sort of pivot between aggression and value. Finally, the last sort of category is combo control decks and other combo decks. And these are control decks with combo finishes and other combo decks that I didn't think fit into other categories. So these are things like Scapeshift, lands combo, Thoracle Control, that sort of stuff. These decks seek to basically play a hard control game, but instead of winning with fair threats and planeswalkers, they win with a combo. Moving on to tiers. I'm going to talk about tier lists, and I've assigned a tier to all of the lists in this video. And you have to look at it not as purely hierarchical, but also the tiers are not completely independent from each other. S tier lists are very consistent decks. They're very hard to tech against. They have reasonable matchups into most or all of decks in the format. So most of their matchups are 50-50 or 55-45, 60-40. They have very few like 80-20 matchups. And these are the decks that are almost always going to do well, and they're good to take into blind metas. If you don't know what you're going to face, taking these is pretty much never a bad choice. A tier decks are the top performers that have some weaknesses. They are really consistent. They're generally either fast or hard to be teched against, but they do have some weaknesses. They have some worse matchups, and they can possibly be teched against really hard. So things like, for example, Reanimator is very strong. It's very consistent, but if everybody brings Graveyard Hate, that's the Reanimator deck's going to suffer. You're still going to be a solid choice because people can only dedicate so many slots, and if people are teching against your particular deck, they tend to weaken their other matchups. So these A-tier decks are still good choices, but they're not necessarily the islands of stability that the S-tier decks are. The B-tier decks are where most decks fall, honestly. Most decks have more polarized matchups. They have certain matchups that they kind of crush, and other matchups that they have a really, really hard time dealing with. And being in a B tier doesn't mean that the deck is bad, it just means that the deck really needs a specific metagame for it to thrive. Decks that are really high variance also fall into B tier, because if a deck can win on turn 2 really often, but also folds but it also has like a 40% fail rate or whatever. This is like a super fast combo deck. That's not strong enough to be part of A or S, which is really focused on consistency. These B tier matchups can be really strong tech picks. So for example, something like Tempo, I've thrown into B tier, and it's not because Tempo is a bad deck. It's that Tempo is extremely strong in certain metagames, and then in other games it's middle to weak. C tier decks basically have kind of weak matchup spreads into most metagames, or are just sort of outclassed or outdated. Some of these lists are a little historical, so things like Blue Moon, which is a blue-red control deck, was very popular in Canadian Highlander 5-7 years ago, but it's really struggled to find good results because the mana has been so good that Blood Moons have been taken a loss of strength, and it's just really hard to resist playing 3 or 4 colors because splashing for the better threats tends to give you better results. Most of these lists are not things that would be recommended to just take into the blind, but if you really like the list, you can do well with it because the difference between the tiers is a lot smaller in Canadian Highlander than it is in 64 formats. And then finally, there are some unknown lists that I've put on here. These are lists that are very personal and are either in archetypes that people haven't explored much at all or have kind of fallen off in recent times, and so having established lists for those archetypes is still sort of up in the air. They're useful to know about because these are things you can do in the format, but they're not really lists that are commonplace. So briefly, I have this spreadsheet that I've put together, which lists all of the lists that I'm going to cover today in the video. So we've got the aggressive proactive decks. This is mostly meant for if you want to jump around or you have a specific list that you're looking for. These are sort of the groupings so that you have a quick reference to jump ahead in the video. We've got the aggressive proactive decks, Death and Taxes, Goblins, Monsters, various red decks, Blitz, Initiative. You've got reactive blue decks, Jeskai, Czech, blue-red tempo, Blue Moon, fast combo, Breach Storm, Paradox Academy, Time Vault, Reanimator, Flash Hulk, creature combo, Kiki-Pod, Seekerwalk, non-blue, slower midrange, Atraxa and Taxes, Welder, lands midrange, Jund, black-red midrange, Martyr Proc, Aristocrats, and combo control. These are things like Jeskai Slushie, lands combo, Scapeshift, Thoracle. Sorted by tier, here are the S tiers, here are the A tiers, here are the B tiers, here are the C tiers, and here are the unknowns. I'm going to be covering these in much greater detail as I go through each of the super archetypes. So the first category of decks I want to talk about are the aggro proactive decks. These decks almost exclusively use fast mana for their points. Sorry about that. They pretty much exclusively use fast mana for their points. Mana Crypt, Black Lotus, Moxen. Sometimes you'll see things like Mana Vault or Soul Ring. Rarely you'll see things like Umezawa's Jite or Fourth Aerolingus, but the goal of these decks is to really just go as fast as possible and kill your opponent quickly with sort of minimal levels of disruption. You really kill first, disrupt second, and if you have to grind, you sort of try and figure it out from there. But your main goal is to reduce your opponent's life total to 0 as fast as possible. There's sort of 4 categories. There's the red-based decks, red deck wins, Schmedium Red, Medium Red, Goblins. There are the white-based ones, which are the Death and Taxes variants. There are the black-based aggro decks, which are mono-black aggro and black mold. And then there's the multicolored decks, which are they're not necessarily a primary color with a splash. They're a lot more heavily 2 or 3 color. So these are things like Gruul Monsters, Blitz, Tokens, and Initiative decks. So let's start by looking at Red Deck Wins. So this is Red Deck Wins by Wonky Wombat. Red Deck Wins is an extremely simple deck. It's basically the Canadian Highlander equivalent of Burn in Modern or Legacy. So you'll sometimes see Red Deck Wins go by RDW, by Burn, by Sly, SLIGH, and they basically all refer to the same overarching the same archetype, generally speaking. Something that is different from things like Modern Burn or Legacy Burn is that you have a lot fewer burn spells that are worth playing in Canadian Highlander. In Modern, you get to run 4x Lightning Bolt, 4x Lava Spike, some amount of, I don't know if you get to run Fire Blast in Modern, whatever it is. You get to run a lot of the really high quality burn spells. But in Canadian Highlander, since it's Singleton, you have to reach a little. So you start reaching for 2-mana versions of Lightning Bolt. So Incinerate, Lightning Strike, Searing Spear, Volcanic Hammer, Incendiary Flow, Fire Ambush. Like, these are the sorcery speed ones. You also start reaching for shocks. Burst Lightning, Galvanic Blast. I don't think this deck is playing actual shock. It is playing actual shock. Starfire. Which just means that your damage per card is a lot lower in Canadian Highlander for burn than it is in other formats. So in other formats, you can say, well, all my spells basically deal 3 damage. I need 7 of them to win the game. In Canadian Highlander, that's not necessarily the case, because your spells do more like 2.5 damage each. Because there's sort of a limit to how deep you can go on burn spells, RDW decks tend to play a lot more creatures in Canadian Highlander than they would in other formats. I think a creature count around the 30s to, low to mid 30s is pretty common in RDW. And most of these things are either 1-mana, 2-power creatures or things with haste. Haste is really a huge priority for red deck wins because your goal is to end the game quickly and you want good top decks. Typical in RDW lists are really low land counts, because you really don't want to draw too many lands. You can operate on 2 mana sources most of the time, sometimes going up to 3, because sometimes you play 3-drops. Some RDW decks don't even play 3-drops. Let's see, other things. The sort of default preferred point spread right now is Black Lotus and Mox Ruby for red deck wins, but the beauty of red deck wins is actually that the points basically don't matter. You could play a 0-point red deck wins deck, and it really doesn't look very different, and still performs mostly the same. Part of this is because red deck wins is one of the weaknesses of red deck wins is that it mulligans extremely poorly. You really want as many cards in your hand as possible, because you need every card. You pretty much need every card that you can get to deal enough damage to get over the finish line, which means you don't have the opportunity to aggressively mulligan for your cards that give you very high power spikes. Which means that in the grand scheme of things, 1 or 2 cards being, instead of being Mox Ruby and Black Lotus, that just being a couple more mountains, yes, it's a decrease in power, but it's not such a decrease in power that it matters. So RDW actually makes a really great budget deck, because you can cut a lot of the expensive things like fetch lands and the very expensive power pieces for much more budget-friendly alternatives. RDW is a pretty strong deck. It's an A+ tier deck because it's very fast, it's consistent, and it really punishes people for stumbling. RDW doesn't have the fastest goldfish speed of the various aggro decks, because, again, your damage per card is lower. But if someone stumbles, if your combo deck opponent stumbles or your control opponent doesn't find the right cards to get underneath, it's really strong. And it always has reach to get around blockers to get over the finish line. RDW is a great deck for beginners, but it's also has a lot of mastery built into it, because some of the RDW really operates on thin margins, and so some of the games that are won by master RDW players are games that newer RDW players would not do well with, because there's a lot of math involved in terms of when do you send burn at blockers versus face, when do you trade, how do you trade creatures, do you attack with more creatures, how do you use your activated abilities that you have. Overall, RDW is a pretty excellent deck to bring to any metagame. It's a little vulnerable to getting beaten out by bigger mid-range decks, or bigger aggro decks, but it still has the speed and the reach that it's basically never a bad idea. Building up from red deck wins is a deck called Schmedium Red. This list is by me, and essentially what Schmedium Red does is, instead of playing shocks, we still play a couple shocks, but instead of playing shocks in all of the lightning strike variants, you replace these things with creatures with soul mana. So you have a lot more 2-drops, a lot more 3-drops, and you go up to 4. Schmedium Red lists generally don't go to 5-drops, and the closest analog that I can give is that these decks are kind of like the red prison decks in Legacy without the prison elements, because it's just kind of hard to find the prison elements on a regular basis. Or it's more like has like if you looked at older standard formats like Raminap Red or Hazard Red, where you have really strong early games, but you have late game value engines that can grind and put out more damage. So the main benefit of playing Schmedium Red over RDW is you get to use soul mana. So things like Mana Crypt, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders. These give you higher power spikes because you get to power out 3 drops and 4 drops early. And your damage per card is generally higher because, you know, a 3 drop that is swinging for haste or whatever is usually a lot more powerful than, you know, a 1 mana 2/1. But you still play some of those, obviously, to fill your curve. Schmedium Red is still a very consistent deck. It's definitely not as budget friendly. It suffers from the fact that it is monocolor, and you're prone to sort of anemic draws. If you don't draw your fast mana, you can still play a reasonable game of Magic, but your deck looks much, much better when it has access to more mana. So, you know, if your Mana Crypt gets countered or destroyed, then you can have a hand that goes from being great to really bad because you're stuck with a handful of 3 drops. It also has a lot less reach than something like a normal red deck wins deck has, but while it has less reach, it also has slightly better grinding power because top decking a 3 drop late game or a 4 drop late game tends to be more impactful than top decking you know, 1 mana 2/1. So Schmedium Red is pretty simple. It's basically take RDW, cut the shocks and stuff, add 3 drops in soul mana, and go from there. The next deck to talk about is Medium Red. Medium Red actually was a predated Schmedium Red. Generally, beforehand it was RDW, and then if you wanted to go bigger, you went to Medium Red. Medium Red is kind of the even slightly bigger cousin of Schmedium Red, in that you play more soul mana with things like Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, and you go even higher on the curve. You play 5 drops, some of the big hasty dragons. You play a lot more 4 drops because the 4 drops are extremely impactful, and a lot of 3s. And you're really trying to skip the 1 drop curve. Like you'll see, you know, here there's only Vagabond for the 1 drop in this Medium Red list. And you're really just trying to power out 4 drops and 5 drops. You'll even see some burn that doesn't necessarily go to face in things like Medium Red because you're intending for the game to go a little bit longer so you can get to your really big creatures, which means you're not so concerned about throwing every single piece of burn to face. You're concerned about getting to the point where your high impact 4s and 5s take over the game. Let's see. Yeah, there's even more fast mana. Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, Crystal Vein. See more mana sinks. Things like Mishra's Factory, Mutavault, Urza Saga. See things like the One Ring to draw you some cards. Yeah. And in things like Schmedium Red or Medium Red, you're more likely to see things like Magus of the Moon and Blood Moon in order to try to cripple your opponent. Whereas in something like Red Deck Wins, you really just need every card to be dealing damage, so you don't have room for that. I have a couple of Medium Red lists here. This Medium Red list was by Demonic Tutor, and another one was sent to me by Mox Pebble. These decks tend to run the mediums, what's called the quote-unquote medium spread, which is the Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, Mana Vault spread, which gives lots of colorless mana, which incentivizes going bigger on the curve, but also really restricts your ability to cast multi-pip spells. And the main differences between these two lists, besides the inclusion of snow versus not snow mountains, is that Mox Pebble decided to run fetches, and fetches are really good with things like Squee Dubious Monarch and Grim Lavamancer. And Demonic Tutor preferred having Snowlands for Faceless Haven. He also has Sandstone Needle as a depletion land as another accelerant, whereas Mox Pebble is a little bit lower to the ground and has things like Rashad Port to restrict the opponent's mana, while also having some more direct burn spells. Overall, Medium Red is a list that has quite a lot of high variance. It's very high upsides, very low a low floor, because when your deck really focuses on getting things started around 3s and 4s, if you don't have fast mana starts, then the deck is kind of anemic. If you're expecting to face a lot of combo opponents or opponents that are going to take out your mana, then it can be hard to get off the ground. It's still quite a fast and strong deck, so it's rarely a bad choice to bring a medium red list, but it is a weakness that is worth being aware of. And if you want to go fast, you probably should be looking at a lower curve version of red. But if you want to sort of beat up on slower mid-range decks and go over them, medium red is a great way of doing that. The last red deck I want to talk about is Goblins. Goblins is this sort of creature synergy aggro deck that also can have a combo finish, which is rather unique in the context of Highlander. Goblins can be built a couple ways. It can be mono red, it can be black red, it can be Jund. This list by Dentro is mono red. And what you do is, instead of having sort of the best aggro cards for one like RDW has, is you have a lot of cards that are a little anemic on their front side, such as Cacophony Scamp or Foundry Street Denizen. But when you combine them together with a lot of goblins, they sort of all synergize together and can do a lot of really tricky things. And they create a lot of damage out of nowhere. Goblins has a million activated abilities, like Goblin Sledder that can sacrifice goblins to pump other creatures, which makes blocking a nightmare. Ways to give your goblins haste with Battlecry Goblin. Goblins is just can have really explosive draws, but it can also have sort of weird anemic draws where the synergy pieces don't line up, or something gets removed and the whole thing kind of falls apart. But with that being said, it's still playing a lot of creatures that are generally low-costed and can turn sideways. We don't have the density to play things like the name sticker goblin decks that you might see in Legacy, that are extremely explosive. But what we do have instead is Goblin Recruiter. Goblin Recruiter, when it comes into play, lets you search your library for any number of goblin cards, put them on top of your you reveal them, and then you put them on top of your deck in any order. Your opponent doesn't get to know what order they are, they just get to know that they're goblins. The Goblin Recruiter pile that wins the game, if you untap with it and are not interacted with, is Conspicuous Snoop, followed by Skirk Prospector and Torch Courier, and Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. So what happens is, Goblin Recruiter puts it on top so that Snoop is your first card. You draw Snoop and play Snoop. This reveals your Skirk Prospector, and now your Conspicuous Snoop has the activated ability of Skirk Prospector. So you use the Snoop to sacrifice your Goblin Recruiter to make mana to cast your Skirk Prospector off the top of your library. And then this reveals Torch Courier, and if you have another mana or another Goblin to sacrifice, you can then cast Torch Courier off the top of your library. Torch Courier can sacrifice itself to give another creature haste until end of turn. So you use that to give your Conspicuous Snoop haste, because the top of your library is now Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. And with Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, you can tap to put to create a token that's a copy of a target non-legendary creature you control, and it has haste. But you have to sacrifice the token at the end of turn. Snoop has the ability of Kiki-Jiki, but is not itself legendary, so you tap Snoop to copy itself, which creates an untapped version of Snoop. You can keep doing this to create infinite numbers of tapped Conspicuous Snoops. And you might think, okay, that's infinite Snoops, how is this helpful? Well, now that you have a Skirk Prospector out, this means that you have infinite mana, which means you can cast any number of goblins off the top of your library. When you have infinite creatures, infinite mana, you can cast your Kiki-Jiki and then eventually get into something like Pashlek Mons, which says whenever Pashlek Mons or another goblin you control dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. You have infinite amount of infinite amount of Snoops. You have a Sack Outlet and Skirk Prospector. You have a Pashlek Mons on board. You sacrifice all your Snoops. You deal infinite damage to your opponent, and that's the end. And this combo can really come quite quickly, because with fast mana you can get Goblin Recruiter out as early as like turn 1 or 2. So Goblins is a rare aggro deck that can play the aggro game and also have a pretty fast combo pivot. It does usually require you to pass the turn, unless you have a way to draw into your Goblin Recruiter stack. But it is an explosive effect, to say the least. Another way you can build it, besides mono red, is you can play black red. And this is the black red goblins by Fifo Fionn. And black just gives you some more trickier goblins. It gives you things like Putrid Goblin and Metallic Mimic, which lets you, Metallic Mimic is obviously not black, but Metallic Mimic lets you choose a creature type, and creatures you control enter the battlefield of that type enter the battlefield with a counter on it. Putrid Goblin has Persist, so when it dies, it comes back with a -1 counter. If you have Metallic Mimic and Putrid Goblin, then when the Putrid Goblin dies, it'll come back with a -1 counter. The +1/+1 counter will cancel it out. It'll be able to die and die and come back infinitely. This means that if you have your sack outlet like Stork Prospector, that's infinite mana. If you add another thing in there, that's infinite damage, so on and so forth. Yeah, basically black-red gives you access to more tricky goblins, and you get some value effects like Reanimate or Unearth that are really useful. And sometimes it'll give you access to tutors. Now, both this black-red goblins and the mono-red goblins that I've shown are both on Black Lotus Mox Ruby, but sometimes you'll see black-red goblins will play things like Demonic Tutor or Imperial Seal, ways to find Goblin Recruiter and become have more slots dedicated towards finding combo pieces. Let's see what else to say about these decks. The Goblins deck is definitely a strong deck. It doesn't have nearly the same average goldfish speed, I would say, as something like Red Deck Wins or even Schmedium Red, but it has a lot higher explosive potential and a really cool combo pivot, which makes it very tricky to play against. So it's still a very strong deck to take to most metas, just because it has that versatility sort of baked into the show. All right, moving past goblins, we're going to talk about Death and Taxes. So there's a lot of ways you can build it. This Death and Taxes list is by Yeti. He's a very proficient Death and Taxes player on the Discord. And Death and Taxes is a little bit different than you would expect from something like Legacy, in that it is more of an aggro deck with some disruptive pieces built into it. So you have your mainstays like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Archon of Emeria, even things like Anointed Peacekeeper or Elite Spellbinder that can slow down your opponent, really restrict what they're able to do. But unlike in Legacy, where you get to run 4 ofs of a lot of things, plus 4 recruiters to go find everything and tie everything together, and 4 Ether Vials, you don't get to do that in Highlander. So what this means is that you generally have to build it more like an aggro deck, and most Death and Taxes lists at this point opt for a humans sort of sub-theme. Things like Champion of the Parish, Coppercoat Vanguard, Thalia's Lieutenant, because a lot of the really good Hate Bears, Containment Priest, Sanctifier and Vec, Aethersworn Canonist, these cards are sort of all incidentally humans. It's a little strange, but it works really well. Death and Taxes will oftentimes also play like an artifact package. You'll have the typical that you'll see in Legacy of Stoneforge Mystic plus Cauldron Complete. And usually some of the top of the curve for Death and Taxes will be things like White Plume Adventurer, Seasoned Engineer, Palace Jailer, these sort of emblem effects that will take over the game. Death and Taxes is also notable because, sort of like Schmedium Red, it's known for taking really good advantage of soul mana. So you'll usually see Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, Mana Crypt, sometimes more things, Strip Mine and Wasteland for mana denial, Rashad Port for mana denial, Field of Ruin, because some decks, this one is not on it, but some decks will run things like Leonin Arbiter or even Mind Sensor, which can restrict searching. And really, the Death and Taxes deck is a very aggressive low to the ground deck that throws that instead of using burn for reach, throws in disruptive pieces. Mono white is usually the preferred way of playing this, but another popular version of Death and Taxes is the red white version. This one's by No Good Decisions, and basically what happens is when you switch to red white, you get more mid-range pieces, sort of more like 3-drops, more impactful 3-drops and 4-drops, but you lose some of the consistency that mono white gives you, and also you will sometimes step on your own hate effects will step on you. So things like Leonin Arbiter, in mono white, you don't even have to play fetch lands, so in mono white, even though this isn't on Leonin Arbiter, it's not affected by that sort of effect at all, whereas in red white, you have to play fetch lands in order to make your mana a little bit better, which means that sometimes your effects will fight against each other. You do get access to powerful effects like Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon, some better removal. Lightning Bolt, Flame Slash, Chain Lightning lets you get through things. Price of Progress is really good at punishing all those really greedy 3 and 4 color decks, and even, honestly, a lot of 2 color decks that are not built to play around Price of Progress will get hurt a lot by Price of Progress. Yeah, but it's a similar concept. This one also has a human sub-theme, and you'll notice that it actually has Winota as a curve topper, because being able to flip, hate bears into play and lots of powerful effects is really strong. Actually, this deck is maybe the closest translation from something like Winota in competitive EDH, CDH, but you're generally not playing things like Thorn of Amethyst, you're just relying strictly on hate bears for your disruption. Death and Taxes is an extremely consistent archetype. It does very well in most metas. It's not necessarily the best hunter of combo, but it's really good against combo because when it hits a disruptive piece, it usually makes combo decks stumble quite a lot, which means that the aggro game plan is extremely likely to succeed. Whereas something like RDW can just get goldfished and they have nothing they can do about it. Death and Taxes has pretty good matchups against a lot of the board. It struggles a lot against bigger aggro decks. So aggro decks that go bigger than it can, if they don't get run over by it with a really low to the ground draw, will tend to make the Death and Taxes deck sort of stumble, or sort of stall, because they really don't run that much removal and sort of rely on just sort of getting under everybody and slowing them down. And if your opponent can stabilize, Death and Taxes doesn't have the reach that burn gives you. Moving on to black-based aggro. Black-based aggro it's very popular in the sense that a lot of people really like playing mono-black aggro. And it's a very favorite pet deck. But it does have a lot more weaknesses than the mono-white or the mono-red aggro decks. Black-based aggro tends to play more like what people would call in the old days suicide black, because it really leverages its life total in order to get aggressive threats. So things like Carnophage will deal damage to you, Vampire Lacerator, Graph Reaver, these things all deal damage to you. It's got Snuff Out and Dismember are really cheap interaction spells that can get rid of things, but they require you to pay a lot of life. One of the coolest and most dangerous finishers is Karavek's Spite. Triple black, sacrifice all your permanents, discard your hand, make target opponent lose 5, or target player lose 5 life. So this is like really all in. One of the advantages that mono black tends to give versus something like mono white or mono red is that a lot of its threats are kind of sticky. So things like Bloodstone Champion, Lifetime Passholder, Bloodghast, Cult Conscript, these things all can come back from your graveyard, either for free or for low activations, which means that sweepers that would typically set a mono white deck back just it's not that mono black doesn't get affected by them, but it recovers a lot. It can recover a lot faster. It also just has some really giant things that don't cost enough. Things like Rotting Regisaur. It's a 7/6 for 3. That will kill people very quickly, but also it requires you to discard a card, which is not necessarily a downside with all the creatures that come back from the graveyard, but it's something to keep in mind. I've been sent 2 lists, one by Hal, and one by Wonky Wombat, and they actually have quite a few differences if we look at the comparison. So the differences is that, well, besides the swamp versus snow-covered swamp, is that Wombat likes a lot more sort of, I don't know how to put this. He likes a lot more creature 3-drops and a little bit of acceleration with Chromox, but things like Nighthawk Scavenger, Lord Skitter, Op Agent, these things are sort of generically good, and he likes playing all of the 1-mana 2-power creatures, so Rakdos Cackler, Tremendous Hero, Dungeon Crawler, Gnarled Scarhide, whereas Hal likes to have sort of planeswalkers like Liliana of the Veil, Liliana of Last Hope to grind, Urza Saga, Gix, which draws you cards. Yeah, I mean, really, they're very similar, but they've taken different approaches where Hal's deck kind of likes to grind a little bit more, and Wombat's likes to play all of the 1-power creatures plus some of the sort of generic 3-drops. Mono Black Aggro is a fun deck, and it's a pretty cool deck, but it really suffers in comparison to the Mono White and Mono Red matchups because you don't have the same reach that Mono Red does. You don't have the same disruption that Mono White does, and you really just don't have exactly the same card quality. They've been printing a lot of really good cards for Red and White in the last few years, and Mono Black has not really seen the same love at the low sort of the low costs, which makes Mono Black Aggro sort of a tough sell. It doesn't really utilize the same sort of like Ancient Tomb core that you might see in Legacy. Like in Legacy, you'll see people play things like 4x. What's the deck called? 4x Exsanguinator Cavalier. They get to play 4x Op Agent. They get to play Shieldred. They get to play that. We just don't have the density of fast mana and good 3-drops in Black to make that game plan that prevalence. Black is really a lot more pip dense than White or Red can be in Highlander, which makes it restricted towards these low curve aggro decks, and that can it hasn't aged as well as Mono Red or Mono White. Mono Black is really good against decks with a lot of red removal that are trying to control the board by just killing everything because it has a lot of self-recursion. It's pretty bad against exile-based removal, and if people can stabilize the board, it's very difficult for Mono Black to get through it because they just don't have the same reach as Red does. Another popular variant is Black Mold, which is usually it's black-based aggro. So it's kind of like if you took Mono Black aggro and you added green to it. And this shores up a lot of things. First of all, you get higher card quality by playing another color. Your cards aren't nearly as bad. Tarmogoyf is a really good card. Mosswood Dread Knight, Cankerbloom, Hexdrinker. You get all these cards that are just really quite potent by splashing green. And you get things like Grist, or, you just get a lot of higher impact cards. But probably more importantly, what you get is you get access to things which can deal with artifacts and enchantments. It's not often that you'll actually see that many artifacts or enchantments that hurt you, but Mono Black basically has zero way of dealing with them, whereas Black Green has at least some game against them. So if you're playing against an artifact combo deck in Mono Black, you kind of just have to hope to race, whereas in Black Mold, you at least have some answers with Cankerbloom, Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy. This is another deck that is not super competitive, but is pretty common in terms of popularity in smaller metas. Now we're moving on to the multicolored ones, and we're going to talk about Gruul Monsters. Gruul Monsters is probably the most consistent aggro deck in the format currently. It's an S tier deck because you just get such a good combination of speed and card quality that you can really just win a lot of games. It almost doesn't matter what your opponent plays, you can just win through speed sometimes. So Gruul Monsters is basically like the new Medium Red. Medium Red plays a bunch of 5-drops and has a big emphasis on 3s and 4s. And Gruul Monsters does the same thing. It doesn't play nearly as many 5-drops. Plays this one only plays 2. This list by Pirate Robar only plays 2. Glorybringer and Thrun. But you get access to really potent 4-drops in the forms of Ulvenwald Oddity, Questing Beast, Rampaging Raptor, the 2 initiative creatures, Polana and Elena, which pumps up your other creatures and gives them haste. Minsk and Boo is probably the best 4-drop in the deck. And because you're not mono-red, you're green, you're actually sort of green-based. It's a pretty even split, almost. But it is a little bit more green than red. You get access to a lot of mana dorks, which means that you're much better at jumping the curve from 1 to 3. And you're not so reliant on drawing fast mana for your plan to work because you innately have mana acceleration in the form of mana dorks. Let's see. This list plays almost all of the 1 mana dorks: Wild Growth, Utopia Sprawl, Death Shaman, Delighted Halfling, etc. You use Soul Mana, Ancient Tomb, City of Traders. You can grind with Urza Saga. You can disrupt a little bit with Magus of the Moon because you're a 2-color deck. You can mostly support your own, Blood Moon type effect. And really, Gruul Monsters is just like the cream of the crop for sort of chunky aggro, if I had to put it properly. It's not super low curve like red deck wins, but it's extremely consistent, kills people really quickly, and really the only bad matchups that it has, from my understanding, and in my opinion, the only really bad matchups it has are combo decks, and even then, it generally has enough of a raw speed that it can at least have a fighting chance, even if it's not completely favored against combo decks. You'll see a lot of different point spreads for Gruul Monsters. Pirate Robar's opted for Mana Crypt, Mox Emerald, Strip Mine, which is quite strong. You'll sometimes see the medium spread, which is Crypt, Soul Ring, Mana Vault. Sometimes you'll see triple Mox, Mana Vault, or just triple Mox. There's a lot of room for different types of points in this type of deck. And, I think some people are even testing Natural Order in the list. But the core of the deck is so strong, the core, like 90 cards, whatever the deck, are so strong, that really it doesn't matter what you do with the last 10 flex slots. Alright, moving on from Gruul Monsters, I'm going to talk about Blitz. So, Gruul Blitz it's sort of a mixture. It's sort of an offshoot of red deck wins. It is mostly red and just a little bit of green. And basically, the point of Gruul Blitz is that shocks that RDW has to play are really low impact. It's 2 damage for a spell. Pump spells, on the other hand, are very efficient. Reckless Charge is 1 mana. It gives +3/+0 in haste. Brute Force gives +3/+3. Collision Colossus. Colossus gives +4/+2 in Trample. Clothful Might gives +4/+2 in Trample. These pump spells are more damage per mana than burn spells, generally speaking. What they have, though, is that because they're pump spells, they have a vulnerability in that if you cast a pump spell and your creature gets removed, you get blown out. You've lost 2 cards for 1, essentially. It's not guaranteed damage in the same way that burn is, but it is a higher damage per card. So This Gruul Blitz list looks kind of like an RDW list, but changing up some of the early threats in order to stay kind of low curve, and playing lots of pump spells instead of cutting the worst of the burn spells for the best of the pump spells. What this does is it increases your goldfish speed. Gruul Blitz on average, I think, is probably maybe 1.5 turns faster than Red Deck wins, but you trade that speed for increased vulnerability. So whereas Red Deck wins is very consistent, and it's pretty hard to interact favorably with burn spells, because even counter spells usually trade down on mana, Gruul Blitz is very prone to, I play my creature, I cast a pump spell on it, I cast a second pump spell on it, my opponent hits it with a Swords to Plowshares, and then I've lost 3 of my cards and have done 0 damage. So Blitz is very good for when all you want to do is race, but is sort of weak into very interactive metas. Another version of Blitz, this one by Fifai Fionn, is Rug Blitz. And what Rug Blitz does is, instead of playing sort of a red base splashing green, is you play sort of a very even rug sort of mana base. It's mostly blue-red, actually splashing green for pump spells. And this really focuses on prowess creatures, so things like Monastery Swift Spear, Soulscar Mage, Balmor Battle Mage Captain, all these creatures that basically grow by casting spells, and you get consistency because you get to play a decent number of cantrips, and also supplement your cantrips with the green pump spells, which are very efficient. Turning your base 1/1 Deeproot Champion that grows when you cast spells into a base 6 power creature with scale up is really strong. This is basically the same as Red-Green Blitz, but with a blue-red prowess sort of shell. So there's a lot less burn and a lot more cantrips, and it's just a lot of more cantrips, really, and a decent number of pump spells. This runs into a similar issue as Red-Green Blitz in that all of your creatures kind of need stuff to scale with. If you're not scaling these creatures that are kind of below rate, which means that if you aren't chaining things, or if you aren't getting your creatures down before you start casting your cantrips, you have some trouble. But it can be extremely explosive because, having a Monastery Swift Spear and a Balmor or whatever, and then casting Gitaxian Probe, Ponder, Preordain, Become Immense is a huge amount of damage. Playing a Dreadhorde Arcanist and casting Become Immense on it, and then it flashes back Become Immense, and then you Berserk it, is extremely strong. Extremely explosive. It has sort of all the same weaknesses that Red-Green Blitz does, with maybe a little bit less average speed and a little bit more consistency because you've traded red aggression for blue cantrips. Another way you can build an aggro deck is by playing tokens. So this is a Mardu Tokens deck by Grim Hortons. If you follow the Yellow Jacket meta, as of the time of this recording, he has done very well with this. Won quite a few Monday Night Highlanders with Mardu Tokens. And the premise of this deck is that rather than playing individual threats that are good, obviously you play some individual threats that are good, you attempt to swarm the board by going wide with tokens. This is actually quite a powerful way to fight the general build of Canadian Highlander decks. A lot of Canadian Highlander decks really rely on 1-for-1 removal, Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, etc. And when those removal spells are trading with half a card or less because they're hitting a token, they look really, really bad. An interesting thing that the Mardu Tokens list has done is that it has an interesting mixture of go-wide threats like Raise the Alarm, Lingering Souls, and so on, that create a lot of bodies that make 1-for-1 removal hard and incentivize board wipes, but it also has some standalone threats that are sort of must answer. Things like White Plume Adventurer, Palace Jailer, Seasoned Dungeoneer, the various initiative creatures Caves of Chaos, Ravenloft. It even has Winota. The deck is most of the actual creatures themselves are humans, which means that all of your non-human creature tokens will trigger Winota, and if you're flopping, 2 to 3 extra free cards into play per turn, that's extremely strong. Yeah. I'm sure there are other ways you can build this. I think in the past, Naya tokens has traditionally been the go-to, but Grim Portents has had good success with Mardu tokens. I think a thing you have to be careful of is to not fall into the trap of running too many Anthem effects, such as Glorious Anthem and so on, because they're really bad on an empty board, and you just need to have pressure. So Grim Hortons has opted for just the best of the best, flying on the White Tree, Wedding Announcement, and there's always some flex slots. This deck has probably a lower speed on average than a lot of aggro deck, than something like RDW or even like Schmedium Red, because it's not really able to utilize Soul Mana super well. It has Ancient Tomb, but the spread is mostly Mox Jet, Mox Pearl, Mox Ruby, Triple Mox 4th Aerlingus. So it has probably a slightly lower raw goldfish speed, but trades that for being really hard to properly answer, because the mix-up between individual threats that have to be answered and that are not answerable super well with just board wipes, versus the tokens that have to be answered with board wipes because they're not good at being answered by 1-for-1 removal. Gives it a lot of play, gives it a lot of flexibility. Finally, the last aggro list I want to cover is initiative. There's sort of dedicated initiative lists. This one was made by me, and there's two sort of main ideas for playing initiative lists. You can either play a lot of initiative creatures and just sort of play like a normal deck and just hope to hit your 4 mana at some point and eventually win by playing initiative creatures over and over, or you can go really all in. This deck, I know a little bit more about it because I've made it, is really all in. It's got Elvish Spirit Guide, Simian Spirit Guide, we've got Petal and Diamond and Vault and basically every piece of fast mana that you can think of, because your goal is to get a snowballing threat on turn 1 or 2. These creatures like Blood Boil Sorcerer and Stirring Bard, which are the sort of not the cream of the crop creatures, the cream of the crop initiative creatures are things like White Plume Adventurer, Caves of Chaos, Seasoned Engineer, Underbound Adventurer. Those are cards you can just play in a lot of decks, and they're not very embarrassing. Playing a 3/3 for 4, or a 0/4 Defender for 4, those are not good creatures. But if you introduce them early enough, they can snowball the game really, really hard. Probably the closest analog to this deck are things like Mono White Initiative in Vintage, or Boros Initiative in Legacy. We don't have nearly the amount of density as those formats to restrict yourself to 2 colors, although there are Boros Initiative players who have had good success in Canlander. So you kind of need to spread to 3 colors, which means your mana base kind of sucks, but your goal is to mulligan to something that's really fast and degenerate and take over. This type of deck is not something that is super good to bring into a blind meta, because it really preys on decks that are not prepared to fight to the board early, and also are not prepared to counter your stuff early. If you land an initiative threat early and your opponent can't take it from you, the initiative will win you the game. But if you spend, Elvish Spirit Guide, Simian Spirit Guide, Lotus Petal, plus a land, and then play an initiative creature, and then they answer it and then hit you with their Ragavan or something, you're just going to lose the game. It's very easy when you're introducing a mechanic like initiative to have that taken from you and then have it snowball against you. But it's important to know about initiative decks, because even though they are not as popular as they were sort of a year ago, they are things that some people like playing, and they're an interesting sort of parallel to decks in Legacy or Vintage that also use the initiative. Now that we've talked about aggro decks, let's talk about fair blue decks. So fair blue decks basically try to win the game through card advantage. Obviously, this usually means that you have to win with planeswalkers or creatures at some point, but the real win condition is that they just have more cards than their opponent, and their opponent can't really do anything while they win with whatever they choose to. The primary choice of points is Ancestral Recall. At the time of recording, it's the highest pointed card on the points list at 8 points. Nothing really beats the efficiency and raw power of Ancestral Recall for card advantage. Draw 3 at instant speed. For 1, you can flash it back with Snapcaster Mage or Dreadhorde Arcanist. You can rebuy it with Mystic Sanctuary. It's just an extremely powerful card. A lot of decks, especially the decks with white in them, will choose to opt for Mystical Tutor, because Mystical Tutor finds things like Terminus, Ancestral Recall, or Fourth Aerlingus, which is also a good reason to be in the Jeskai core, because Fourth Aerlingus early game for 3 mana can get you the Monarchy, and if you can protect the Monarchy, you win the card advantage game by drawing an extra card every turn. And then late game, you tutor it up with Mystical Tutor, send it in for X equals 5 or 7 or whatever, and just kill your opponent in 1 or 2 swings. You also see things like Treasure Cruise, but basically card advantage is the name of the game. Almost all 3-color blue decks are viable in Canadian Highlander, but the blue-red core is particularly strong, so things like Jeskai Green, Czech, which is 4-color no white, are very powerful. Decks like Bug or Grixis do exist, but generally you're very incentivized to splash colors in blue decks in Canadian Highlander because you get access to better threat density and just better finishers, and sometimes better removal as well. So let's get into lists. The first list is Jeskai Stoneblade by Jay Wyatt. It's opting for Recall, Fourth Aerlingus, and Treasure Cruise as its points, and Jeskai essentially seeks to play the best removal spells, counter magic, and cantrips to, just play fundamental magic. Things like Flame Slash, Chain Lightning, Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, Force of Will, Counterspell. It basically doesn't have a bad matchup against almost any deck in the format because it has answers for almost anything. And cantrips like Cataclysmic Probe, Ponder, Preordain, Brainstorm, give you the consistency to find what you need when you need it. Jeskai decks will often have early card advantage engines, such as Ragavan, Nibble Pilferer, or Dreadhorde Arcanist, and will usually have as their top end either more card advantage engines or just giant beaters, so things like Aragorn, King of Gondor is a Vigilance lifelink. He gives you the Monarch. It's very good at stabilizing the board. Triumph of St. Catherine is excellent against stuff like aggro because it's a 5/5 lifelink, and if it dies, you can probably miracle it again, and miracles for only 2, so setting it up with Brainstorm is very common. Solitude and Fury are both early game removal spells in a pinch, but late game are also just very serviceable, 2-for-1 creatures, 2 or more for 1 creatures that can beat your opponent down. Murktide Regent's Giant in the mid to late game. Most Jeskai decks will lean... So Jeskai can be built in a couple of different ways. In the past, it was very popular to build Jeskai with a lot harder of a control slant. So you'd see things like 11 creature Jeskai or whatever, a lot more sweepers. This Jeskai Stoneblade list by Jay Wyatt is only on Brotherhood's end for sweepers, and so it's a lot more of a mid-range deck. It's choosing to use Stoneforge Mystic as its sort of unique card advantage engine. Stoneforge Mystic can either go and find Batterskull, which is a very powerful stabilizing creature, or it can find Cryptic Coat, which is newly printed as the time of this recording, which it's a slow engine, but you play it, it basically makes you a 2/2, which draws you a card. You bounce it back to your hand, you play it again, it gets you another new creature, and it's this sort of grindy card advantage engine. Something that's worth noticing about reactive blue decks in Canadian Highlander, as opposed to decks like Legacy or Vintage or even Modern, really, is that the range of what you have to play is a lot wider, the range of cards. So we don't get 4 Ponders and 4 Brainstorms, we get 1 of each. So you get Ponder, Brainstorm, Preordain is, acceptable, but then you have to start going into into the less good cantrips, Sleight of Hand, Cinema Visions, Opt, Consider, which are cards that you don't usually see in older Eternal formats. We have Force of Will and Force of Negation and Mental Misstep, which are, the free counter spells, and we even have Spell Pierce, which sees a lot of play in, Spell Pierce and Daze, which see a lot of play in stuff like Legacy and Vintage, but that's only so much counter magic. We need to get farther. So you'll usually see things like Spell Snare, Stifle, which you won't usually see in most decks in other formats, other than like Stifle Knot, is very common here in Canadian Highlander because there's a lot more activated abilities, and you just need early interaction. And then obviously we go into 2-mana counterspells. We have actual factual counterspell, but you might see things like Mana Drain or Memory Lapse, Mana Leak, Lose Focus, Remand. These are cards that either don't see play or were sort of phased out of most 64 formats, but our card pool needs, our singleton needs mean that we need to dig deeper into the card pool for our answers. You'll even see counterspells that are higher up on the curve, like Cryptic Command or Mystic Confluence, because they're modal. In Canadian Highlander, you don't always have the luxury of having efficient answers for everything that you need, so sometimes you are okay with having a late game spell that costs a lot more, but is very flexible. Mystic Confluence being a bounce 3 or a counter bounce draw or counter draw 2 is really strong in the late game, but sometimes it'll rot in your hand early game. And this is just sort of what you have to deal with in 100 card singleton as opposed to 64 formats. I was sent to the second Jeskai list by Impulse, and this is Jeskai Pyromancer. It's very similar. Instead of running Treasure Cruise, it's running Mystical Tutor, which means that instead of Brotherhood's End, it's running Terminus as its sweeper of choice. But rather than have the Stoneforge Mystic plan, it's basically got Pyromancers, Young Pyromancer, Third Path Iconoclast, Monastery Mentor. So if we look at the comparisons, the Stoneblade deck is running, obviously, the Stoneforge package with Batterskull, Crypticode, Stoneforge Mystic, and it's running some more, other early creatures, Pyrokinesis. But the Pyromancer list is running a lot more cards that care about casting spells. Dragon's Rage Channeler, Young Pyromancer, Budget Shredder, Third Path, that sort of thing. And obviously there's a difference in points between Mystical versus Treasure Cruise. Generally speaking, for decks that lean towards a more mid-range slant, you'll often see both White Plume Adventurer and Seasoned Engineer as sort of top end, because they're the best, the cheapest initiative creature and like the best initiative creature, and the initiative is a really good way of turning the corner very quickly and ending games. In decks that are more controlling, you will sometimes see one or both of these omitted because there's a danger in introducing the initiative and then losing it, because it's a very snowbally mechanic. But at the same time, if you can land the initiative creature and then protect it, it's very easy to snowball the game out of control. So that was Jeskai. Now, the next deck is Jeskai Green, and this is basically if you take Jeskai and splash for all the green design mistakes. Jeskai Green is more prone to being played as a control deck as opposed to a mid-range deck, because your threats you have just much stronger top-end threats, and being 4-color, you are naturally a little slower to get your mana underneath you, and most of your threats that you're splashing for are higher on the curve, so you're not nearly as lean. Things like Minskamboo, Uro, Alnath Locus of Creation, Oko Thief of Crowns, Ren and 6. These are just like, a who's who of all the design mistakes in the last, I don't know, this is probably like the last 5 years at this point. What is time? But Jeskai Green is very similar to Jeskai. It's still playing all the same, the usual interaction and stuff. You'll see that most Jeskai Green lists are on 1 or 2 more lands than pure Jeskai lists. Both Jeskai and Jeskai Green love a good Library of Alexandria in the opening hand. Even though it's a colorless land, the card advantage it can provide in an opening 7 is pretty much unparalleled. This Jeskai Green deck, you'll notice, is on 3 sweepers: Brotherhood's End, Supreme Verdict, and Terminus, which means that it's really, really just looking to control the board and then take over the game with a late game value engine, as opposed to fighting for the board early and often. something that is not in Canadian Highlander that you might expect from things like Modern, well, not anymore because it got banned, is Up the Beanstalk. Up the Beanstalk is something you can play in Canadian Highlander decks, but it's usually not very good because we don't have the density of spells to support it. This deck is not even on Leyline Binding, but if you were to run a Jeskai Green deck, you'd be on maybe Leyline Binding, Force of Will, Lorien Revealed, Terminus, Triumph, Fury, Murktide, and that might be it, honestly. Murktide, Solitude. You're only on like 7 or 8 hits that trigger your Beanstalk without actually costing you 5 mana. And that's just not really very viable in Canadian Highlander, so the whole Jeskai Bean deck is a lot rarer in Canlander than you would expect. Another Jeskai Green list that I was sent was by Violet Eventide, and if we look at the comparisons, Violet Eventide prefers having more low-to-the-ground creatures, such as Tarmogoyf, Tashana's Tidebinder, and Ledger Shredder, and drops one of the sweepers. So she's not on Supreme Verdict, whereas Impulse is on Supreme Verdict, and Solitude, and Dovin's Veto. And Violet Eventide also doesn't like running the initiative in what's essentially a control deck, because, as I stated when talking about Jeskai, pure Jeskai, introducing the initiative can be quite dangerous if you get it taken from you, and Violet decided that she doesn't need to run the initiative creatures, whereas Impulse is okay with running just White Bloom Adventurer. A third Jeskai Green deck that I was sent was by Thomas Simmons, and Thomas Simmons' deck is the most different of these because he opted for Recall, Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, which means he's not on Fourth Aerlingus, which is one of the more powerful cards that's been printed recently, and instead just opted for pure card advantage in terms of points. As a comparison between, we do a comparison between Simmons' deck and Impulse's deck, you'll notice that there's actually a lot of differences. There are no sweepers in Simmons' deck. He's not on Brotherhood's End, Terminus, or Supreme Verdict. He's just on Pyrokinesis and Fury. And there's a lot more low-to-the-ground threats. Dragon's Race Channeler, Tarmogoyf, Fairy Mastermind, Ledger Shredder. And Simmons' deck, Thomas's deck, is really a lot more of a mid-range deck that's seeking to just go over the top with the top end, as opposed to controlling the board with sweepers and then eventually playing a value-generating permanent. Jeskai Green is an excellent deck. Jeskai is also a really good deck. Jeskai Green's sort of the strongest of the mid-range killers. It's very hard to lose most mid-range matchups with the Jeskai Green deck because your threat quality is so high and your interaction, the amount of interaction you have is so high. But because your threats tend to be a little bit clunkier as opposed to something like pure Jeskai, you lose a little bit of speed, which means that your combo matchup is usually a little bit worse. But Jeskai Green is one of the strongest decks in the format, and so really taking a Jeskai Green deck to an event is almost never a bad idea. Alright, moving on to Czech. Czech refers to 4-color, no white, and we didn't get that from Canadian Highlander. There was an old legacy player, Tomas Mar, who was known for his 4-color control pile, 4-color mid-range control pile that used Deathbred Shaman and was non-white. And he was very successful with it. He played a lot of very greedy cards like Kolaghan's Command, Hymn to Turok, etc. These just strong 2-for-1 spells that were very pip intense. And he was from the Czech Republic, so it became known as Czech Pile, and the Canadian Highlander community has generally adopted that idea of Czech Pile, meaning a 4-color, no white, mid-range / control deck. So this Czech by Jay Wyatt is it's another blue-red control deck. It's still a blue-red core. It's mostly, actually this is, I guess, a blue-black core, blue-black-red. It's Grixis core, and still plays a lot of very efficient removal, counter spells, card advantage, etc. You don't get 4th Aerlingus because you're not in white, but But what you get is you get things like Orcish Bowmasters and Opposition Agent, which are really powerful hate bears. And you get hand attacks such as Duress, Inquisition of Kozilek, Thoughtseize. And what this does is it improves your combo matchup significantly. So Czech generally gets played more mid-rangey than Control because you get fewer hard sweepers. You'll get things like Brotherhood's End or Toxic Deluge, but you won't get things like Terminus, Supreme Verdict, the things that just say, I want everything gone, remove it now. You still get the very good top end with things like Minsk and Boo, Ogo, Ren and 6 for consistency, and it's very similar to Jeskai, but you sort of switch some of your matchups. Instead of being good against all the fair decks, you get you're still good against a lot of fair decks, but have a better combo matchup. Another way to build Czech was sent to me by Genghis Prawn, and this is a little bit of an older build, but it's also a no proxy build, which doesn't use Ancestral Recall. So it's Demonic Tutor, Strip Mine, Dig Through Time, Manage Drain, Treasure Cruise. And really what I wanted to highlight between these two lists is not the proxy versus non-proxy, but the way that you can build the decks can be quite different. Jay Wyatt chose to basically use almost a pure Grixis core that was just splashing the green design mistakes, much like how the Jeskai Green decks are Jeskai splashing all the good planeswalkers and stuff. Genghis instead chose to have a lot more green in his deck, so he's playing things like Tarmogoyf, Abrupt Decay, Assassin's Trophy. These are sort of catch-all answers that you lose when you move away from white, but you can get by playing the black-green spells. It just means that you have a higher commitment of green to the deck. Czech is still a very strong deck. It's very well-rounded, but it has a little bit worse of a time against the bigger, fair mid-range decks, as a result of being better against combo. So it's still very good to take into most metas, still a top performer, but it definitely has a little bit more exploitable weaknesses, in my opinion, compared to something like Jeskai or Jeskai Green. Alright, moving on to Tempo, Blue-Red Tempo by Windy. This Blue-Red Tempo is essentially a deck that's trying to play very low to the ground threats, very cheap threats, and then back them up with counter magic so that they can go the distance and end the game. I don't want to say quickly, because it's not quick in the sense of like a red deck wins or a Gruul Monsters or something where it's trying to win by like turn 4 or 5. But the idea is to sort of protect the queen, play some threats, protect those threats, have them go the distance. So rather than controlling the game and then playing a threat, turn 4 or 5 or 6, you want to get a threat deployed turn 1 or 2 and then protect it for the rest of the game. This is probably the most similar deck to something like Delver in Legacy or Blue-Red Murktide in Modern, because you'll see things like Actual Delver, Secrets, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Sprite Dragon, Questing Druid, those types of things. Because we're 100 card singleton, we have to dive quite a bit deeper. You have to play things like Terramander and Malcolm and Electrostatic Infantry. But the core of the game plan is land an early threat and protect it and win through card advantage. And it's not even necessarily win through card advantage in that like you plan to have the game go really long, but it's win through a bunch of 1-for-1 interaction and then refuel and keep doing 1-for-1 interaction. Tempo is also known for playing a lot of very narrow cards such as Force Spike or Delay. These are cards that you won't usually see in most other decks because they're either very narrow, like this is only good if your opponent doesn't have the 1 to pay, which is rare except for in the early game. Delay doesn't actually counter the spell, like it counters the spell and puts it on suspend for 3 turns, but then you have to deal with it again later. And the whole point is that you're just buying time so that your creatures can finish the job. It's also noticeably lower to the ground. This Blue-Red Tempo deck only has 30 lands in it, which is extremely low for a Canadian Highlander deck. And that's because really Tempo wants to play a very low resource game and operate mostly on 2 to 3 mana sources, and then just keep drawing interaction for the rest of the game. Interaction and draw spells. Blue-Red Tempo's really struggled in the last few years. As the quality of mid-range threats has increased, it's been a lot harder to sort of play this one-for-one game plan and, play these really sort of cheap, not very powerful threats. Terramander is a 1/1 that you eventually have to spend mana into to maybe turn it into a 5/5. Electrostatic Infantry starts as a 1/2 and it grows, but if you draw this on turn 4 or whatever, it's not going to have the same impact as a pure mid-range value piece like Aragorn, for example. So tempo really struggles into stuff like mid-range and aggro decks. It depends on the mid-range. It can have an okay setup against mid-range. It's really bad against aggro decks because it's hard to trade up on mana when dealing with very aggressive decks, and stuff like Red Deck Winds actually plays so many shocks that it can actually just pick off all your creatures really cheaply. What tempo is really good against are combo decks, because it's really good at putting a threat into play and then just making it impossible for your opponent to resolve spells. Tempo is still a fan favorite archetype, and it's a very cool translation of sort of the Delver and Murktide lists from other formats. But it's definitely more of a meta pick or a personal call rather than a generic all-round choice. The last deck I want to talk about is Blue Moon. Blue Moon is sort of a historical deck for Canadian Highlander. If you had looked at the format 7 years ago or whatever, Blue Moon would have been the premier control deck, would have been the top-tier control deck of the format. And Blue Moon is essentially a hard control deck that plays Blood Moons and Back to Basics, and sometimes Magus of the Moon. And the difficulty of trying to set up Blood Moon or Back to Basics locks in Canadian Highlander is that your mana just sort of sucks. And this is true of a lot of decks. A lot of decks' mana sucks, but we don't get to play 4 Prismatic Vista and then 8 fetches, and so you can play entirely on basics. Usually, you as the Blue Moon player still have to play quite a few non-basics in your deck. This deck is only on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's on 9. It's on only 9 fetches and 13 basics, so that's 22. That means it still has to play 15 non-basic lands, which are going to get hit by your Back to Basics or Blood Moon. So it's a lot harder to break parity on your own effects. And also, in a 100-card singleton, it's really hard to find Back to Basics or Blood Moon. These are not colors that can tutor up either of these cards. And it's a lot harder to build a 3-color deck that can splash for stuff like Blood Moon, because, again, the mana is so much harder in Canadian Highlander than in 64 formats. In addition, there's sort of been a rise of things that can innately defeat Blood Moon. Things like Initiative or the Lord of the Rings Land Cyclers just let people break out of Blood Moon locks, even while being stuck on. Even when a Blood Moon lands, they can play something that gives them a basic to get out of a Blood Moon lock. And honestly, there have been so many threats that have been printed over the last 7 years or so that are just big enough that red removal doesn't always deal with them cleanly. Red removal is very efficient, it's very cheap, but a lightning bolt is not going to kill a 4/4. And a braid is not going to kill a 4/4. Really, this deck has like 3 cards that can kill. It has 3 cards that deal more than 4 damage to a creature. Sinkhole, Flame of Enor, Unholy Heat, and it has 2 more, Pyrokinesis and Fury, that can deal with, and Flame Slash, so 3 more that can deal with 4 toughness creatures. This really means that there's a lot of things in the format right now that either start out too big for red removal or quickly grow beyond the reach of red removal, and that just makes it very hard to play a deck like Blue Moon in 2024 because you just can't answer everything. A lot of decks at this point just prefer to be 3 or 4 color because you get way higher threat quality. This deck plays really hard control, but also it just doesn't have the top end. It doesn't have the Minsc and Boos or the Comets of the world. It doesn't have the 4th Aerlingus, etc. And you just get better removal. If you splash white, you get Source to Plowshares, Path to Exile, Prismatic Ending, that sort of stuff. So Blue Moon is important to know about for historical reasons, but is not particularly strong as a competitive deck these days. So those were the pair blue decks. Let's move on to fast combo decks. Fast combo in this format basically refers to any combo deck that can win or put themselves in extremely winning state by turn 2 or 3. Obviously, they don't always win by turn 2 or 3, but I would say that the average Goldfish speed of when a fast combo deck wants to do their thing to win the game is probably about turn 4. Many of the combo decks rely on really powerful combo pieces that are themselves points. These combos are deemed so strong they are on the points list. So things like Time Vault obviously play the namesake card Time Vault, which is 7 points. Breach Storm plays Underworld Breach. Flash Hulk plays Flash. Other times you'll see a lot of combo decks will pay points for tutors, so things like Tinker in Paradox Academy or Demonic Tutor in Reanimator. So I think that there are 3 sort of main categories of fast combo decks. They're the graveyard-based ones, which include things like Breach Storm and Reanimator. There's the artifact-based ones, which include things like Time Vault, Paradox Academy, or 5-color Walker Omnitell, which doesn't need to explicitly use artifacts, but the particular build that I'm going to show you does. That could fit just into other spell-based. And then other spell-based decks are things like Flash Hulk, which does technically use the graveyard, but it dodges most conventional graveyard hate, or Doomsday. So let's look at some lists to get an idea of what a combo list looks like. So the first list we're going to look at is Lotus Breach. This one's by Jaded Trekkie. Unlike in Modern, where Breach is either fueled only by Grinding Station combo or is just a value piece, and unlike in Vintage, where Breach is usually layered with a bunch of other combos, in Canadian Highlander, Breach often is just run as a standalone deck, where Breach is the only combo in the deck. The Underworld Breach combo is based off the namesake card Underworld Breach. It's 1 and a red for an enchantment that gives each of your non-land cards in your graveyard escape, and the escape cost is their mana cost plus exiling 3 other cards from your graveyard. You use this in combination with an artifact that can sacrifice to produce mana, such as Black Lotus or Lion's Eye Diamond. These give you bursts of 3 mana. Lion's Eye Diamond requires you to discard your hand, Black Lotus doesn't. And then you use a card that mills yourself. And the most efficient card for milling yourself is Brain Freeze. Brain Freeze says target player puts the top 3 cards of their library into the graveyard, and it has Storm. We call this a Storm deck because it evolved from old Yawgmoth Wheel Storm decks, which tried to win with Tendrils of Agony, and early builds of Breach. I mean, honestly, up until like the last year or two, many versions of Breach Storm included Tendrils of Agony as a win condition. In reality, the deck doesn't really resemble a Storm deck. You're not trying to reach a specific number of spells cast. You're just trying to assemble a combo and then win from there. Brain Freeze is good because it lets you mill your entire deck, and then once your entire deck is milled, you can escape Black Lotus or Lion's Eye Diamond and either Brain Freeze your opponent, which mills your opponent out so they'll die on their draw step, or you just recast Lightning Bolts enough times to, kill your opponent with damage. Like I said, Breach is not usually layered with any other combos in Canadian Highlander. It can be, but it's a lot harder to make it work because Breach itself costs points, and finding pieces requires a lot of effort in Canadian Highlander. So you'll see the quality of tutors that are used in Canadian Highlander are very, very different from stuff like Vintage or even Legacy. We want to get Underworld Breach, so we're playing Transmute 2s. We're playing things like Fabricate, or Grim Tutor, or Idyllic Tutor, Ristic Tutor, even things like Moonblessed Cleric, 3-mana tutors that are putting things on top of your library or into your hand. These are very low on the efficiency scale, but when your deck is built around finding a certain tiny set of cards, this is what you need to do. The Breach Storm list is basically just filled with a smidgen of rituals, a bunch of hand attack spells to poke holes in the opponent's game plan, and then a bunch of cantrips and tutors to be able to assemble the combo. Most Breach lists do not run counterspells. They instead prefer to run things like Orm's Chant and Silence and Veil of Summer. These are things and even stuff like City of Solitude, in order to protect themselves against counterspells. This means that they're almost entirely proactive. There's very little that they're trying to do to protect themselves, except in the minimal case of getting rid of hate bears. So, things like Lightning Bolt doubles as a removal spell and a win condition when you do the breach combo, but you'll see things like Balance or Toxic Deluge, for example, to help clear effects like Balthy Void Walker or Archon of Area that would stop the combo from going off. I was sent a second breach list by Robin Sorensen. This is Canadian Highlander Council member Robin Sorensen. It's one of his pet decks. And if we look at the differences between Trekkie's and Sorensen's list, Trekkie chooses to run a lot more removal, so to speak, things like Chain of Vapor and Balance and Toxic Deluge in order to clear away permanents that are preventing you from winning, whereas Sorensen prefers to just go faster. So he's playing additional milling, self-milling cards like False Memories. Put the top 7 of your cards in your graveyard at the end of turn. Exile 7 cards. If you're winning all in the same turn, that's just, it doesn't matter that you have to remove cards from your graveyard at the end of turn. Things like Vision Charm, good old Dan staple. The important mode is that it mills you for 4. It's a 1-mana card that mills you for 4. And even the Grinding Station combo, which you might have seen in Modern, which is you play Grinding Station. It has tap, sack, and artifact. Target player mills 3. And then whenever an artifact comes into play, you can untap it. What this means is that if you have a 0-cost artifact, you can keep playing the 0-cost artifact out of your graveyard with Underworld Breach by exiling 3 cards, and then Grinding Station refunds the 3 cards that you used to escape that 0-cost artifact. If you have something like Grim Monolith that you can tap for mana without having to sacrifice it, you can actually start generating mana as you're looping. So Lotus Breach is quite fast. I would say that the average Goldfish of a Lotus Breach deck is probably around turn 3, 3.3, which is extremely fast for a 100-card singleton format. It's vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, Rule of Law effects, enchantment removal, but it tends to bypass that because it's really fast. So it's a pretty strong deck to take, even if people are somewhat prepared for it. Obviously, if people really hard tech against it, it can suffer quite a lot, but it also can just win games based on raw speed. Another way you can build Breach is by playing it without Lotus. So playing like a pure Breach combo deck, you can still play Breach without Lotus because you can use Lion's Eye Diamond instead, which is 0 points. And what this does is it gives you more tutors. So Demonic Tutor, Vampire Tutor, Gifts Ungiven, and Intuition are the points that Captain Camel has chosen for his Lotusless version of the deck. Demonic Tutor is nice because you can find it from a Transmute 2, and that means your Transmute 2 gets Demonic Tutor, you Demonic Tutor for Breach, and then at some point you play Breach, escape your Demonic Tutor for LED, get mana with LED, escape Demonic Tutor for Brain Freeze, and it basically lets you move everything through a single Transmute 2, which you can technically do in Lotus Breach with Infernal Tutor, but Infernal Tutor requires your hand to be empty, which either means you need to have the ability to play everything out, or you need to already have Lion's Eye Diamond in hand. Intuition and Gifts Ungiven are also 1-card ways of setting up the Breach combo, because what you do is you Intuition for Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Sevine's Reclamation, and Sevine's Reclamation lets you return a permanent with mana value of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has flashback, so no matter what they give you, you can always get the Breach combo set up, and then if you have enough cards in your yard, you flashback, you get Underworld Breach plus Lion's Eye Diamond, and then you can escape Intuition to go get Brain Freeze, and so on, and then you perform the normal Breach combo. Lotusless Breach is generally like roughly a turn slower than Lotus Breach on average, which means it's not the preferred version for a lot of the dedicated Breach pilots. A lot of the dedicated Breach pilots really prefer the speed that Lotus gives you. But there are other ways you can build Lotusless Breach. You can layer it with Oath of Druids. You can put it into a control shell. So there's another deck that I will talk about in the other combo section, in the combo control section, called Jeskai Slushie, which is a Jeskai control deck that uses the Breach combo set up via Intuition and Gifts Ungiven. So the combo package is a lot smaller, because really the only things you need for the combo are Brain Freeze, Breach, LED. And then obviously if you're doing Intuition, Gifts Ungiven, Sevrek, Intuition. So if we look at the differences between Breach and Lotusless Breach, really the only differences are the points. You take out some of the higher costed tutors for the pointed tutors, and go from there. Breach is a pretty powerful deck. Like I said, it's almost never a bad thing to take, but it is vulnerable to a lot of forms of interaction, both in terms of graveyard hate and enchantment removal, and things like rule of law effects. Okay, that was Lotus Breach. Let's talk about Paradox Academy. So Paradox Academy is a classic Canlander deck, and you might notice that things like, well, I don't think Vintage Jewel plays it, but things like Legacy Jewel will play Paradox Engine now. Basically, Paradox Academy is named after two cards. It's the Paradox Engine, just a 5-mana artifact that says whenever you cast a spell, you untap all non-land permanents you control. And the very powerful land, Tolarian Academy, which taps to add blue for each artifact you control. Basically, the game plan of Paradox Academy is you play a bunch of mana rocks, and this lets you, if you get a Paradox Engine in play with a bunch of mana rocks, you can, everything you cast untaps all your mana rocks, which makes you a lot of mana, which then you can turn into draw spells, either with things like the One Ring, which conveniently untaps with Paradox Engine. The One Ring was a very good card to be printed. It's a very big help to this deck when it was printed. Or you play things like Wheel of Fortune, Time Twister, big draw spells to draw into more cards and eventually assemble like a 3 or 4 card combo. So, for example, some combos are things like if you have Basalt Monolith and Rings of Brighthearth, Basalt Monolith taps for 3, and for 3 generic you can untap it. And Rings of Brighthearth says whenever you activate an ability, if it isn't a mana ability, you can pay 2 to copy the ability. So what you do is you tap Basalt Monolith for 3, you untap it for 3, copy that ability for 2, and that means that in between untapping the Basalt Monolith, you can tap it again, so you make 6 mana, spend 5 to get 6. This is infinite colorless mana. Once you have infinite colorless mana, you can do things like get Walking Ballista, send a million damage upstairs because it's infinite. You can do things like when you have Paradox Engine, and if you have make enough mana with Capsize, you can Capsize infinitely with Buyback, which means that you can bounce every permanent in play, and also usually generate infinite mana at that point. If you have things like Rings of Brighthearth with Voltaic Key and Candelabra of Tawnos and Tolarian Academy, you use the Voltaic Key to untap a target artifact targeting the Candelabra. You copy it with Rings of Brighthearth to untap the Voltaic Key. This untaps your Candelabra and your Voltaic Key, but you use the Candelabra to untap your Tolarian Academy, and if your Tolarian Academy is making enough mana, this is infinite blue mana, and then eventually you can untap other lands and make infinite any other color mana and use that mana to do something. There's a lot of like 3 or 4 card combos. If you've got Rings of Brighthearth plus Basalt Monolith plus Sensei's Dividing Top, you've got infinite colorless mana, and top has an activated ability to draw and put the top on top. Well, if you copy that ability, what you do is you draw your top card, put top on top, and then you draw top. And so if you've got infinite colorless mana, you can just keep playing out your top and just draw your deck that way. Same with Paradox Engine, and Rings of Brighthearth and top, and enough mana rocks that you can pay for top activations. If you've got things like Voltaic Key and top and Paradox Engine that also draws your deck, it's basically a non-deterministic, I don't want to say it's non-deterministic, because there's a lot of ways you can assemble your 3 or 4 piece combos, but it's not an A plus B combo deck. It's taking advantage of the synergy between all these different pieces to make huge amounts of mana and then do something with it. The backup plan, when you're making huge amounts of mana, is to play things like Ugin. Ugin is 8 mana, but in this deck that can easily make like 25 mana, that's not a big deal. Wipe your opponent's board, start bolting them, eventually draw into a win. Things like Urza or Urza Saga can produce constructs, which then allow you to, beat down your opponent with these giant constructs because your deck has 44 artifacts in it. One thing that's notable about Paradox Academy is that it's not typically running things like Coveted Jewel, like in some other formats. It's also not typically running stuff like Paradoxical Outcome. There's just not enough density of that. You can run those cards, but they have their upsides and downsides. Typically, what this deck used to run is it used to run 7 to 8 Wheel of Fortune effects, which are effects that make each player discard their hand and then draw 7 cards, usually. And the reason is that when you're making a lot of mana with Paradox Engine and you're just trying to find pieces of your 3 or 4 card combos, drawing lots of cards is very good for doing that, and the wheels are sort of the easiest way to do that, because they're usually pretty cheap or refund you mana, and just draw you a fresh 7. This has become riskier in modern day Magic because giving your control opponent, your blue opponent, a fresh 7 cards makes it so that you're likely to give them interaction, which means that they can stop what you're doing. So Uber has decided to go down to only a few wheel effects. I think just the best 3, Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, and Time Spiral. But other things that the deck can do is it can do things like balance your opponent, because the deck is very good at playing lots of mana rocks early on and operating on very few lands. So if you just play 4 cards turn 1 off of all the different mana rocks because they all fuel each other, and then you balance your opponent on 1 land and you have no cards in hand, it's a very powerful effect. The deck also doesn't run that many creatures and also doesn't care about its creatures for the most part. It does run Hull Breacher and Narset to break parity on the wheels a little bit. Tinker is a key part of the deck. Most of the time when you see this deck, you'll see Tinker, Mana Vault, Mystical Tutor, and Tolarian Academy. Those are sort of the stock points of the list, and the last 4 can change. Usually it's Sol Ring, but it can be other points. That's because Tinker goes and finds you Chromatic Orrery, Engine. It finds you any of your artifact pieces, but notably Chromatic Orrery lets you spend mana over mana of any color, and it's a huge rock. Yeah, basically this deck is it's a lot of fun, because you kind of have to draw a lot of cards and look at a lot of things and try and have to sort of piece together a win. It's actually a little bit slower on average than most of the fast combo decks. It probably looks to win by like turn 4 to 6 because it just takes some time to get set up unless it has a really nut draw. But once it gets going, all of its pieces synergize and create giant amounts of mana and draw lots of cards, and it's just very hard to stop. So Paradox Academy is pretty good at stymieing sort of the faster, sort of the slower aggro decks. Stuff with like balance just sort of sets people back to the Stone Age. But it's a little bit slower as far as combo decks go, and sometimes is vulnerable to being collapsed by playing a bunch of mana rocks and then have nothing to do, or has one important spell like one wheel or one tutor, and that gets stymied by an opponent's counterspell. Alright, that was Paradox Academy. Let's talk about Time Vault. So this time, Sonsbury Time Vault list by Joking 101 uses Time Vault, Mana Vault, Canadian Pact, and Tolarian Academy. The thing to understand about Time Vault and Canadian Highlander is that Time Vault technically is very adaptable. It can fit into a lot of shells because what it needs is pretty minimal in terms of both color requirement and slot requirement, because the way that Time Vault combo works is Time Vault's a 2-mana artifact that comes into play tapped, and you tap it to take an extra turn, but Time Vault doesn't untap during your untap step, and you have to skip a turn to untap the Time Vault. The way that you get around this is you play something that untaps the Time Vault, so things like Manifold Key or Voltaic Key, and this gives you infinite turns. Once you have infinite turns, you can sort of win with a wet noodle, doesn't really matter. And it's very cheap, Time Vault's 2 mana, this is 1 mana, you can be winning as early as, I guess, technically turn 1. It's not really turn 1 when you take infinite turns, but you can be taking infinite turns extremely easily, and this is all colorless, so it can fit into almost any shell, but the issue is that Time Vault is 7 points, which really restricts the power of the decks that you're putting it in if they're not actively looking to assemble Time Vault. So Time Vault is not usually used so much as an incidental win, it's usually used as a core game plan, unlike in some decks in Vintage. Also, unlike in Vintage, you tend to play a lot more untappers, so things like Voltaic Servant, Teferi's Lotus Sunset. Tezzeret the Seeker is great because he tutors Time Vault by himself with his -X, and he untaps it with his +1, so he's like a 1-card combo. Things like Oswald can go and get, both of the pieces, Tribute Mage, Trinket Mage, because of things like Voltaic Servant, Tribute Mage gets both parts of the combo. And the way that this deck is structured is that it's got the threat of the Time Vault combo, which can win very quickly, but it's sort of built into this artifact control mid-range shell. I don't want to call it hard control, but it's got this mid-range plan where it punches through with hand attack. It's got some removal pieces. It's got balance to wipe the board because it's not playing very many creatures, but it also has a lot of counterspells to help protect its combo and buy time to find its pieces. Unlike something like Storm, which was like purely proactive and didn't really play much protection outside of silences, this one plays a lot of things that can actually interact with the opponent, because it can just play a reasonable mid-range game plan with Urza Saga constructs, Karn, Oko, etc., until it assembles its infinite combo. Even things like Sword of the Meekin, Thopter Foundry, and Retrofitter all play really well with Academy and Urza Saga and stuff. And it just sort of all layers together into this cohesive artifact mid-range game plan that happens to have the ability to sort of pivot immediately into a Time Vault combo. And this is also partially because things like Manifold Key are really good with constructs because you can make your constructs unblockable. They're good with things like the One Ring to draw you more cards, untapping blockers, etc. I was also sent another Time Vault list, which is a little bit more of I don't want to say it's more traditional, because this Sans Red Time Vault list by Joking is closer to what old Time Vault lists in 2017 would look like, where they were really old Time Vault lists were really hard control lists that use Time Vault as a win condition. And Joking's list plays a lot of counterspells, but it's not like super hard control. But in the past couple years, in like 2020 through 2022, Vault became sort of associated with more of a mid-range game plan, like in this Jeskai Vault by JCK Knox, where you're playing a lot more proactive threats. You're basically playing, Red gives you stuff like Goblin Engineer, which tutors, it entombs an artifact, and then you can sort of weld things in that are 3 CMC or less. And this lets you get the Time Vault combo out of your graveyard. And Red gives you, more stuff like Lightning Bolt and Galvanic Blast. And basically what this Jeskai Vault list is trying to do is, it's not really trying to play control at all. You'll see there's no counterspells at all, but it's trying to play this value artifact game plan, stuff like Shorikai, the One Ring, Experimental Synthesizer, Broadside Bombardiers, and then also has the pivot into the Time Vault combo. Notably, this type of game plan is very good against fair blue decks because most of the artifact engines are sort of armies in a can. Urza Saga makes 2 artifacts and tutors half of your Time Vault combo because it can get Voltaic Key or Manifold Key, or it gets Retrofitter Foundry. And it's really hard for decks that are relying on 1-for-1 removal to outgrind things that can just produce multiple bodies, sort of endlessly. And also, effects like the One Ring or Shorikai Genesis Engine are very good at giving you tons of card advantage, which is very difficult to keep up with for decks that mostly rely on things like Treasure Cruise or Ancestral Recall as their main bursts of card advantage. So these decks are really good at grinding, while also making your opponent respect the sort of combo game plan. I would say that Time Vault's a really strong deck. It's probably worth bringing into almost any meta, but it is vulnerable to artifact hate because it is essentially an artifact combo deck. It's an artifact your combo's an artifact deck, and most of your mid-range pieces are also artifact pieces. Okay, moving on from Time Vault, let's talk about Reanimator. So there's a few different flavors of Reanimator, and unlike in Legacy, for example, in Legacy, Reanimator decks are typically black-red, and you expect to see them reanimating things on like turn 1 or 2, maybe usually turn 1 or 2. It's a lot harder to do that in 100-card Singleton because we don't get 4x Entomb, 4x Faithless Looting, and multiples of the best Reanimator targets. Usually, the core Reanimator targets are Atraxa, Grizzlebrand, Archon of Cruelty, and Sarah's Emissary. Almost everybody includes Lord of Change as well, and it's pretty free to include Troll of Khazad-dûm because it's part of your mana base, so you just cycle it away. Some decks, like this blue-black Reanimator deck, include cards such as Trench Gorger. Trench Gorger's 8 mana 6/6 trample, but the 6/6 doesn't matter because when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for any number of land cards and exile them. And then if you do that, Trench Gorger's power and toughness become equal to the number of cards exiled this way. So the reason that this is in the deck is that you reanimate it and get rid of, the 24 lands in your deck or whatever, and it can just one-shot people. And this is most commonly used with the reanimation spell Shallow Grave, which takes the top creature card of your library, puts it into play and gives it haste, and then you exile the creature at the end of turn. So you swing with a hasty 24/24 or whatever, that usually wins the game. Reanimator is a 0-point combo deck in the sense that none of its combo pieces are points, which means it gets to use all of its points on tutors and card advantage. So this blue-black Reanimator list is on Demonic Tutor, Vampire Tutor, Dig Through Time, Imperial Seal, Intuition, Mystical Tutor, Treasure Cruise. Basically, as many tutors as it can reasonably fit. It's on stuff like Grief and Unmask in order to strip away hands, as well as normal hand attack spells. Collective Brutality is another meaningful one because you can pitch a Reanimator target that's stuck in your hand and also take away counter spells. And it's just on as many reanimation spells as it can reasonably play. Things like Animate Dead, Stitch Together, which only works if you have Threshold, Exhume, Life Death, which is basically Reanimate, but for 2 mana and only your graveyard. Even things like Dance of the Dead, which brings the thing into play tapped and you have to pay to untap it, or Necromancy, which is 3 mana. The deck really does aim to get, especially this blue-black version, aims to get a monster into play by probably turn 3 or 4 at the latest. And unlike most combo decks, where their combo wins the game, the Reanimator combo deck, like putting a Reanimator target doesn't just win the game on the spot. It usually takes another turn or two, but if you reanimate an Atraxa or a Grizzlebrand or an Archon of Cruelty, you're in a very, very advantaged position compared to, say, a mid-range deck. And obviously, this deck has the turbo aspect where if you get a Trench Gorger plus a Shallow Grave, you can just one-shot people. Crayon also sent me another list, which is an Esper Reanimator list. And the thing about the mana in Canadian Highlander, especially when it comes to very fast combo decks, I'm just going to run a compare real quick, is that when you're running a really low land count, 32 lands or whatever, it's very difficult to splash extra colors. So for a while, Grixis Reanimator was the preferred turbo Reanimator deck of the format, because you got access to things like Sneak Attack as an additional way of putting big idiots into play. It just turns out that it's really hard on the mana, and so if you want to splash other colors, you want to go slower. So Esper Reanimator is not really a full-on control deck, but it is slower than Blue-Black Reanimator and intends to basically protect its combo, protect itself with Daze, Mana Leak, Remand, these types of counter spells so that it can build up to like a turn 4 or turn 5 reanimation. And this makes it a little bit slower and a little bit more controlling, but I wouldn't call it hard control. It does get to play cool things like Balance and Dam, and the really neat thing is that it gets to play Gifts Ungiven, and the reason it gets to play Gifts Ungiven is that when you play Gifts Ungiven, Gifts Ungiven says search your library for 4 cards with different names and reveal them. A target opponent chooses 2 of them, and you put the chosen cards in the graveyard and the rest into your hand, and then you shuffle your library. So the neat thing about this is that you can choose to only find 2 cards instead of 4. So you can find things like Unburial Rites plus a reanimation target. Now, the main thing in this deck actually appears to be... I don't actually see an Unburial Rites in this deck. What I see in this deck is instead of From the Catacombs. From the Catacombs is a sorcery, 5-mana sorcery. You put a target creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a corpse counter. You get the initiative, and if that creature would leave the battlefield, you exile it, and you can escape this card. So what you can do with Gifts Ungiven is you can go and get From the Catacombs plus a reanimation target, plus an Entomb, plus another reanimation target, whatever. You can basically set up piles with Gifts Ungiven so that you can always reanimate something out of the graveyard. Esper also gives you access to things like Teferi, which help protect your combo and your creatures because you can't get counterspelled while this is out. Priest of Fellrights is an uncounterable way of putting a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I mean, obviously you can counter the Priest of Fellrights, but if it's in play, it's just an activated ability, and in the graveyard, it has Unearth, which basically is an activated ability as well, so unless you're getting stifled, this is another way to sort of get around counterspells and sort of give you more staying power for a longer game for reanimating targets. You'll notice that, like, sort of the differences between the Esper and the blue-black. The blue-black is running things like Dark Ritual so that it can just turbo out things, turn 1, Swamp, Dark Ritual, Entomb, Reanimate, Swamp, Dark Ritual, Entomb, Shallow Grave, Trench Towards Your Dead. It's running things like Exhume and Dance of the Dead and Shallow Grave and these sort of the weaker or the worse reanimation spells. And it's just generally trying to go faster, whereas the Esper deck has more interaction. It's not a full-on control deck, but it's got more interaction, as well as the Gifts Ungiven sort of combo. And Buried Alive works with Priest of Fellrights because you go and get your reanimation targets plus Priest. This is like a way to make Buried Alive a one-card version of the combo. So yeah, Reanimator is a pretty consistent deck because it's 0 points. Again, 0 points is in the combo itself doesn't cost any points. You get access to a lot of tutors, which makes you very flexible and lets you find cards that you need. If your hand is set up to do well and then you're dying on board, you just go get a balance. The deck is pretty fast. It's pretty powerful. It tends to beat a lot of the mid-range decks. It is weak to graveyard hate, and obviously because your game plan still involves getting creatures into play, you are vulnerable to some removal. Although a lot of the removal in Canadian Highlander, like Fatal Push or Lightning Bolt, is not going to kill your reanimation targets, but stuff like Swords to Plowshares will. That being said, Reanimator is still a really fast deck, it's still a really good deck, and it's worth playing in almost any meta. Alright, we've talked about Reanimator, let's talk about Flash Hulk. So, Flash Hulk is based around the card Protean Hulk, which is a 7-mana 6/6, which, when it dies, you search your library for any number of creature cards with total CMC 6 or less and put them into play. And Flash, which is a 2-mana instant for 1 and a blue, that says you can put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield, and then if you put a creature on the battlefield this way, you sacrifice it unless you pay its mana cost reduced by up to 2. You don't ever have to choose to pay up to 2, so what you do is you cast Flash, put in a Protean Hulk, the Protean Hulk dies, and you go and get a set of cards that win the game. So the best pile, which came out in Lord of the Rings, is Samwise Gamgee, which is a 2/2 for 2 that says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you make a food. And that's the only relevant part. The other part doesn't matter. You get Cauldron Familiar, which is a 1-mana 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life, but has sacrifice a food to return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. So what this means is that Samwise Gamgee sees Cauldron Familiar come into play and makes a food. And if you can get Cauldron Familiar into your graveyard, you can sacrifice food to get the Cauldron Familiar back, which makes new food from Samwise and can drain your opponent infinitely. Well, the way that you get Cauldron Familiar into your graveyard is you get a sack outlet. So Viscera Seer is a 1-mana 1/1 that just has sacrifice a creature, scry 1. This is 4 mana of your 6 mana that you get from Protean Hulk. So typically what you get is you get Sylvan Safekeeper, because Sylvan Safekeeper says sacrifice a land, target creature you control gains Shroud until end of turn, which means that if your opponent ever tries to remove your creatures, you can protect them. And then Gingerbrute, and the reason why you play Gingerbrute is because Gingerbrute itself, whatever it is, it's a cookie, is itself a food. So this means your Protean Hulk dies, you get Samwise, Cauldron Familiar, Gingerbrute, Safekeeper, Viscera Seer. You have 4 triggers to make foods from Samwise Gamgee. If your opponent tries to remove your creatures in response to the food triggers, you can sacrifice a land to protect your creatures. If for some reason your opponent can then make enough removal spells that they have more removal spells than you have lands, well, you can sacrifice the Cauldron Familiar to Viscera Seer, and then sacrifice the Gingerbrute to the Cauldron Familiar to start the loop again, and now you have a new trigger to get food again and go on top. What this essentially means is that if the Flash Hulk pile resolves, it is not reasonable for any deck to stop it. It's technically possible, but it's essentially uninteractable. And this leads to a win because you just drain your opponent for infinity with Cauldron Familiar. It uses the graveyard, but because the Cauldron Familiar has Sack of Food returned from the graveyard to the battlefield, if you ever let your opponent have more than one food in play while doing this loop, if you try to remove the Cauldron Familiar with something like a Scavenging Ooze or an Endurance, they can just reactivate the Cauldron Familiar by sacking another food and bringing it back and basically go over the top. It basically only loses to static graveyard hate, such as Grafdigger's Cage, Rest in Peace, Dalthy Voidwalker, and obviously anti-tutor effects like even Mind Sensor or Opposition Agent, and also like anti-enter the battlefield like Torpor Orb or Containment Priest, because Containment Priest doesn't let things enter from anywhere other than your hand. Or anywhere than if it wasn't cast. It doesn't let things enter if it wasn't cast. So that's the combo. This combo has been deemed so strong that Flash has gone to 7 points. For a while it was 5 points, and it was really strong. And since it's gone to 7 points, it's become a lot weaker. It's possible that 7 points is too much, but what this means is that you get Flash, and all of your other points are just tutors, because all you need to do is get Protean Hulk into your hand, and then you have a 2-mana instant that wins the game. Which means your combo is instant speed, which is insane. Most combo decks cannot function at instant speed. They're sorcery speed only. And you're playing a lot of tutors to go and find your pieces. So things like Summoner's Pact, which can be found by Mystical Tutor. So your Mystical Tutor goes and gets Flash, or it gets Summoner's Pact, which gets Protean Hulk. The Transmute 2s, Muddled Mixture goes and gets Flash, but it also gets Eladomir's Call, which goes and gets Protean Hulk. Imp Seal, I think there's an Imp Seal in here. No, there's no Imp Seal in here. This one's on Merchant Scroll, which goes and gets Flash or Mystical Tutor for Summoner's Pact for Hulk. Worldly Tutor, Sylvan Tutor, it's playing, honestly, a lot of really god-awful tutors because it can win as early as turn 1 by just playing land, Lotus Petal, Flash, put in the Protean Hulk, win. Flash Hulk also has a ton of interaction because it gets to run at instant speed. It gets to run things like Prismatic Ending, not Prismatic Ending, it's not instant speed, but it plays Hand Attack to protect itself. It plays a bunch of really cheap counter magic to protect itself, cheap or free counter magic, Flusterstorm, Miscast are cheap, Pact of Negation, Daze, Force of Wills. It can protect its own combo with Force of Negation. It also plays silences like Worm's Chant and Silence and Veil of Summer. Flash Hulk is basically just a really all-in turbo fast deck, because if your game plan goes too long, you might draw some of your Protean Hulk pile pieces, which makes it a lot harder to assemble the combo. You might actually have to cast the things, God forbid. And it's just a hard deck for non-blue decks to interact with, because you can obviously counterspell the Flash, but outside of a few specific hate bears, the combo basically can't be interacted with. Flash Hulk is really high variance at this point. Some games you win turn 2 with Force backup and you feel like it's crazy, you can't possibly lose. And then other games, you're stuck on 2 lands and you've cast 4 top deck tutors, but your opponent has counter spells and you just can't do anything. Or you have 1 land and 3 top deck tutors, and you just can't ever get to your second land to actually cast Flash before you die. I wouldn't say that it's that vulnerable to be teched out, although obviously there are tech pieces. Flash Hulk really is very bad against hand attack. Most hand attack, obviously. Sometimes they get lucky with the top of the tech tutors. But it's really bad against hand attack usually, and some hate bear effects. But it's just a very high variance deck at this point, which is why it's not really the best deck anymore. It sort of fluctuates between the best combo deck and, I don't want to say the worst combo deck, but a very hard to play combo deck based on the amount of points that it gets access to. I don't think there's really an analog to Flash Hulk in other formats, because Flash is restricted in Vintage, and there's just better things to do with Flash Hulk than Flash Hulk in Vintage, and obviously Flash is banned in every other format. So I guess it's kind of a unique Highlander deck. I was sent a second Flash Hulk list by Kelvin, so the differences between Kelvin's and Kurokogi's lists are pretty minor. I believe it's Oh, I have the wrong URL. Why is that not working? Wrong URL. There we go. Okay. The differences are pretty minor. Puru's got a couple of more counter spells to have anti-blue and an abrupt decay, whereas Kelvin has more cantrips and tutors and Solar West to go find Summoner's Pact in order to be a little bit faster in terms of Goldfish speed. Okay, that was Flash Hulk. So now let's talk about Doomsday. Doomsday relies on the signature card of the deck, Doomsday. It's triple black for a sorcery, where you search your library and your graveyard for 5 cards and you exile the rest, and then those 5 cards become your library, and you get to choose the order, and you lose half your life when you cast this. What this means is that you basically resolve a Doomsday, and they call it the Doomsday stack or the Doomsday pile, and you basically attempt to draw through your pile and then play a Thassa's Oracle, which wins you the game when you have an empty library. You can technically win the game with up to 2 cards in your library, or up to whatever your Devotion to Blue is, but if you have cards in your library and the Thassa's Oracle gets removed in response to its trigger, you won't win, so usually you just empty your library, play Thassa's Oracle, win the game. This is sort of the premier Thassa's Oracle deck, like fast Thassa's Oracle deck in the format. Because Thassa's Oracle itself combos with the card Tainted Pact, which is not in this list because these are just pure blue-black, so the mana base doesn't support it. But it's pretty hard to find Thassa's Oracle and Tainted Pact or Demonic Consultation. They're sort of opposite card types. They really only get found by pointed tutors, and because Thassa's Oracle is so powerful, this effect is so hard to interact with, Thassa's Oracle itself is 7 points. So Doomsday is like a 0-point combo deck, but really it's a 7-point combo deck because usually you use Thassa's Oracle or sometimes Black Lotus plus Jace Wield of Mysteries. Things that the Doomsday deck gets to play are a lot of hand attack. They get to play Duress, Dreadfugue. Sometimes you'll even see things like Grief or Unmask. Spectre's Shriek is one that you don't see too often, but it's exiles a card from an opponent's hand, and then you pitch one of your own cards unless you exile the black card. Most Doomsday decks rely on Gush, because what you need to do to get into your Doomsday pile is you need to draw through the entire pile, which usually, if you're trying to win the same turn, means you have very little mana, because you just spent 3 mana casting Doomsday. So a lot of piles rely on Gush, which is a free spell that you can cast. Well, it's a 5 mana spell, but you can cast it for free by returning 2 islands to your hand to draw 2 cards. And what this means is it makes your mana base in Canadian Highlander really bad. In Legacy and Vintage, you get to run 4 Underground Seas plus as many fetches as you want to go find those Underground Seas. Here, we've got 1 Underground Sea, 1 Water Grave, and then almost all of your other island swamp duels, your islands tapped for black, have to come into play tapped. So you see like a bunch of Triomes, an Ice Tunnel. I think that this list has not been updated for Murders at Karloff Manor, but you would see the Undercity sewers, the Surveil land from Murders at Markov Manor. Basically, in Canadian Highlander, Doomsday mana bases suck. You want swamps that are islands. You want islands that tap for black. And so your mana base is usually pretty bad. But the deck is very all-in. You're basically just making a lot of cantrips, doing a lot of hand attack, and maybe a couple of the really cheapest interaction spells, counter spells like Fluster Storm or Spell Pierce. And your goal is just to find Doomsday, cast it, resolve it, crack into it. We don't really have the density of artifacts to make something like Beseech the Mirror super effective. Obviously, it still is included in this list, but the artifact count is a little dubious compared to maybe some other formats. And the deck is very similar. It's a very similar analog to the Legacy version, or even sometimes the Vintage version, although obviously you don't get to play all of the power that you get to play in the Vintage version. So there's not much else to say. If you want to learn more about Doomsday, I recommend looking up Vintage Doomsday. vintage and legacy Doomsday guides, because they have all the primers and everything that you would need to know everything about building piles and such. Okay, why did that not? I got sent a second list by Kelvin. These are both Thoracle Doomsday lists. So in Kelvin's list, he prefers to play things like Deathrite Shaman and Rain of Filth and Blood Pet in order to get to earlier Doomsdays. He also likes things like Arkham's Astrolabe, Control of Khazad-dûm to get more, as a Swamp Cycler, whereas Uber prefers to have more hand attack, more card draw spells, like full-on card draw as opposed to just cantrips. And the One Ring, which the One Ring is a little bit contentious because it's hard to accelerate into, but it lets you draw into a Doomsday pile really easily because you play it, you get protection, you draw a card. The next turn, you cast Doomsday, you get to draw 2 cards off the One Ring. You're already 2 cards deep into your pile. Pretty easy to win from there. But otherwise, they're very similar. I think Kelvin is on Urza Saga in order to get LED. It's sort of a delayed tutor for LED, which is very good. LED is very good both in the piles, but also for casting things like Grim Tutor or Beseech the Queen or Transmuting, because what you do is you play LED, you go and transmute or cast your tutor, you crack LED for black, black, black in response, and you have a Doomsday. You can cast the Doomsday. Obviously, you have no cards in hand, so you usually have to pass the turn, make what's called a pass the turn pile, but it's a very speedy way of casting Doomsday just off of 1 tutor. Doomsday is pretty fast as far as combo decks go. I think most of the time it's looking to win by turn 3 or 4, but it's a little bit weak to aggro decks in a way that other combo decks aren't, because Doomsday halves your life total, and so if you make a Doomsday pile and pass, well, your opponent can still attack you with creatures and potentially kill you, so that's very dangerous. And then also, if you're low enough on life, certain Doomsday piles don't work anymore. Obviously, if you're at 1 life, you can't even cast Doomsday without dying, but some Doomsday piles require you to have Street Wraith to cycle into them, or Gitaxian Probe, which require you to pay life. So that gives it a little bit more vulnerability against aggro decks. It does have the benefit of Thassa's Oracle is extremely hard to interact with, and there's not like a lot of specific hate that it struggles against. I mean, it'll struggle against something like an Archon of Emeria or anti-tutor effects, like Opposition Agent, and I guess stuff that prevents you from drawing cards like Orcish Bowmasters. But otherwise, it doesn't really rely on its graveyard or anything, which is a bonus. It doesn't rely on its graveyard. It doesn't rely on having an enchantment in play like Breach. But it's vulnerable in that it really is put on a pretty serious clock. A lot of aggro decks can't outrace something like a Breach Storm on the regular, but if you can get a Doomsday deck down low enough, it can't even do its thing. Still a really strong deck because it's pretty fast, but yeah, that's Doomsday. So, sort of the last combo deck I want to talk about in the fast combo section is 5-color Walker Omnitell by Excelia. And this deck is by no means a standard deck. This is been played by maybe 2 or 3 people ever, and it's a very personalized list. It's got Demonic Tutor, Tinker, Mana Vault, Mystical Tutor, Flame Academy, Wishclaw Talisman. Excelia updates his list very often, so this is, if you check back on this list in a month, it's probably going to look completely different. But this is the most successful that I have seen and recorded anywhere of a show and tell omniscience type deck. Omnitell, show and tell decks exist in Legacy, but it's a lot harder to get the requisite density here, and basically what this 5-color Walker Omnitell deck does is plays an extremely greedy mana base and does a lot of random, for lack of a better term, it just does a lot of random crap. That just is really powerful and wins the game. So it's got stuff like Channel to channel into Emrakul. But Channel also works really well into getting Chromatic Orrery, which makes your mana costs, lets you spend mana as over mana of any color, which makes your Channel then cast any number of spells, and so on and so forth. You've got Tinker. Tinker can go and get Chromatic Orrery, but it can also get Darksteel Monolith, which lets you play a colorless spell from your hand for 0 rather than pay the mana cost, so it's sort of like an Omniscience for colorless spells. Well, Emrakul is a colorless spell. You can show and tell in Emrakul's or Atraxas. You can Eureka. Eureka puts in Atraxas and Emrakul's and all these value planeswalkers. A lot of these planeswalkers untap various permanents, so you can tinker for a Chromatic Orrery to then play something else that flickers your Chromatic Orrery or untaps it, and that makes you more mana, which lets you do more things. You take extra turns, you bring to light for balances or for Eurekas or Tinkers. This deck is honestly very wild. It's got squandered resources to sort of double its mana out of nowhere. Sometimes you get Omniscience into play and you just cast whatever the heck you want. It's a wild deck that, you'll lose in increasingly embarrassing ways if you ever play against Excelia. And like I said, it's not like a standard deck. In fact, if you wanted to make a show and tell deck, I would say that the main way that you would make it is probably not play 5 colors. But this is something that you can do in the format. It's not something that's very deeply explored, but it is definitely doing very powerful things, because putting in Emrakul's or Atraxas off of show and tells and Eurekas, and then making 1,000,000 mana is something that is extremely strong. I don't really have anything else to say about this deck. It's kind of a wild and crazy deck, and I just wanted to show that you can do things with Channel, you can do things with Show and Tell and Eureka. They're not very popular, but they are things that you can do, and are things that probably deserve more exploration than they have been given. The next category of decks that I want to talk about are creature combo decks. So, creature combo decks are decks that basically, it's kind of in the name that they use creatures to combo with, but they are basically all slower combo decks. In maybe very rare situations, they can win by like turn 4 with a combo, but most of the time they're going to be winning like turn 5, 6 plus with their combos. What this means is that they get to play sort of mid-range game plans, and fair quote-unquote creature game plans that get to pivot into combo, but they don't have the same raw speed as the fast combo decks of the last section. So, the first deck I'm going to talk about is Seekerwalk, and this Seekerwalk list is by Hyun Kim 87, and Seekerwalk the combo is based off of the card Spellseeker, which is a 3-mana 1/1 that finds an instant or sorcery card with CMC 2 or less and puts it into your hand. What you do is you cast Spellseeker, you go and get the card Ephemerate. Ephemerate targets your Spellseeker and flickers it, which means you get to tutor with Spellseeker again. Spellseeker then goes and gets Time Walk. You cast Time Walk and take an extra turn. Ephemerate rebounds to blink your Spellseeker again. And Spellseeker then gets either Green Sun Zenith or Neoform, and you can Green Sun Zenith for Eternal Witness, or Neoform into Timeless Witness, which then goes and gets Ephemerate. You cast Ephemerate on your Timeless Witness, and your Timeless Witness comes back and picks up Time Walk again. You cast Time Walk. You go to your extra turn, Ephemerate rebounds, you can target the Timeless Witness, and because of the way that Ephemerate works, you blink the creature, and then the Ephemerate's in the graveyard, and then you check state-based actions and you put your Timeless Witness trigger on the stack. So Timeless Witness can go and pick up Ephemerate again. What this means is you can keep picking up Ephemerate and Time Walk and take infinite turns. Once you have infinite turns, again, you can win with anything. If your deck's 40 creatures, you'll find something. With enough time, your Planeswalkers will win the game. This basically makes the Spellseeker deck a 1-card combo. All you have to do is find Spellseeker and have, I believe it's 6 mana, because it's 3 plus 4, 1 for Ephemerate, plus 2 for Time Walk. So you have 6 mana. With Spellseeker, you can win the game. The downside is that Spellseeker combo gets interrupted by basically everything. It's a 1/1, so if the Spellseeker dies in response to Ephemerating it, then you don't get any of your other tutors and the combo is done. If there's a Rule of Law effect in play, you can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, which means you can't go and do Ephemerate and Time Walk loops. If you can't cast spells at instant speed because of something like a 3 fairy, like a Teferi Time Raveler, then you can't rebound your Ephemerate. If there's graveyard hate, your opponent can eat your Time Walk or your Ephemerate out of the graveyard, which means the loop is broken. There's a lot of ways that this, goes wrong. Basically, it's probably the most vulnerable combo in the game, in the format, but it's a 1-card combo, so it is quite powerful. The points are always going to be Time Walk and Spellseeker, because that's part of the combo. Time Walk is 7 points, Spellseeker is 2. And then the last point can be kind of whatever. Hyun has opted for 4th Aerolingus because this is a deck that is trying to make a lot of mana for its combo, so it's got a lot of mana dorks. And when you have a lot of mana, pumping it into 4th Aerolingus is a really good way to win the game. This Seekerwalk deck is generally sort of like a creature toolbox deck. You've got a lot of tutors like Fauna Shaman and Fiend Artisan, Eladamri's Call, Neoform, ways to get into Spellseeker. You don't need Spellseeker to win the game. If you get all the pieces like Eternal Witness plus Time Walk plus Ephemerate, you don't need the Spellseeker, but it's good to have. And this means that most of its interaction is in the form of creatures. Now, you can't play too many symmetrical hate bears because, again, Spellseeker folds to everything, but you get to play things like Aven Mind Sensor. That seems to really be the only hate bear. And really, the amount of interaction you play is pretty minimal. There's very little removal. Lightning Bolt, Swords of Plowshares, Prismatic Ending. Obviously, in the form of creatures, you've got Moloch and Palace Jailer, and where's Solitude? There's no Solitude in this list. But the goal of the deck is basically play a bunch of mana dorks to develop your mana, play some of the strongest mid-range threats that are printed in these colors, and hope that distracts your opponent long enough that it either wins the game or that you can set up the Spellseeker combo. This deck, recently Pod went to 0, so this deck got to play Pod again. And this means that some Seekerwalk pilots have opted to put the Kiki-Jiki combo, which I will talk about next, into the deck. This deck has opted not to play Kiki-Jiki combo. This deck is really preys on slower metagames. If you're in a metagame where people are just trying to play value creatures and aren't really playing a lot of removal, there's a lot of board-based gameplay, and it's not a fast meta, this deck really preys on that because all it really needs is time and to not be interacted with. But at the same time, doesn't have the best fair game plan, because let me tell you, Wall of Roots and Wall of Omens are not things that attack very well. And its combo requires 6 mana, which is a lot more than most of the fast combo decks, and is interacted by everything, so it's a little bit vulnerable. This is probably the best of the creature combo lists. Creature combo has been sort of on a downswing for a while because it's just been a lot harder to play these sort of not so great creatures like Overgrown Battlement or Sylvan Caryatid that you need for creating mana when mid-range threats are so good. But it still has this sort of toolbox personality, so you can customize the list quite a bit to make it flexible for a lot of metas. It's just not the fastest combo list. And it's also not focused on, it doesn't get the raw speed that you get from things like Moxen or Mana Crypt that you would see in normal mid-range lists that aren't including a combo piece. So that was Seekerwalk. Another creature combo list is Kiki-Pod. This one's by No Good Decisions. And Kiki-Pod used to be extremely popular. It's like probably 6 years ago at this point. And the way that the Kiki-Pod chain works is that you have Birthing Pod, which is 3 in a Phyrexian green for an artifact that has, for 1 in a Phyrexian green and tap it, and sacking a creature, you search your library for a creature with exactly CMC 1 plus the creatures that would sacrifice mana cost, and you put that card onto the battlefield and then shuffle your library. And what you do is you take a creature, such as, say, an Ignoble Hierarch, and you turn it into a Corridor Monitor. Corridor Monitor comes to play and untaps an artifact or a creature you control, so you untap the Birthing Pod. Then you sacrifice the Corridor Monitor, and that goes and gets something like a Pestermite. Pestermite comes in, it untaps the Birthing Pod. You sacrifice the Pestermite, it goes and gets a Felidar Guardian. Felidar Guardian doesn't untap the Birthing Pod, but it exiles it and returns it back into the battlefield, which untaps the Birthing Pod. You sacrifice the Felidar Guardian, and that goes and gets Karmic Guide. Karmic Guide goes and reanimates your Felidar Guardian, which untaps the Birthing Pod. Then you sacrifice your Felidar Guardian again to go and get Kiki-Jiki. Kiki-Jiki is a hasty 2/2 Goblin Shaman that has tap, put a token of a creature you control that's non-legendary. It has haste, and you sacrifice it at the end of turn. Kiki-Jiki taps and copies Karmic Guide, which reanimates Feldar Guardian again, which blinks Kiki-Jiki, thus untapping Kiki-Jiki. And you can then copy Feldar Guardian an infinite number of times and make an infinite number of 1/4s that are hasty, and swing and win the game. Another way to approach this combo is through Survival of the Fittest. If you have a Survival of the Fittest, you can go ahead and discard cards so that you can get Kiki-Jiki and Feldar Guardian into your graveyard, and then have a Karmic Guide, hardcast the Karmic Guide. Karmic Guide brings back the Feldar Guardian, which flickers the Karmic Guide, which brings back the Kiki-Jiki, and you do the same Kiki-Jiki loop. The strength of this combo is that when you're doing it through Birthing Pod, you don't have to cast any spells, which means it's immune to counter spells, asterisk, your Birthing Pod had already resolved. Doing it through Survival of the Fittest is the same way. As long as your Karmic Guide doesn't get countered, you can technically do whatever you want with this. There are alternate Birthing Pod lines you can include, but those are the main ones. You can do similar things with Prime Speaker Vanifar, although Prime Speaker Vanifar requires you to have a 4-drop that untaps it in order to do the full pod chain, because Feldar Guardian blinking Vanifar gives it summoning sickness again. Vivian on the Hunt is like a pod. It lets you pod. It doesn't work with the untappers, but if you pod from a 3-drop into Feldar Guardian blinks the Vivian on the Hunt, and you can do the whole Kiki-Pod loop again. The whole Kiki-Jiki Feldar Guardian loop again. And yeah, so that's sort of the combo of the deck. What this means is that you can sort of put it into like a Naya blue mid-range creature deck. Unlike Seekerwalk, where Spellseeker is 2 points and Time Walk is 7 points, this Kiki-Jiki combo really is a 0-point combo, because Pod is 0 now. And if you want the Survival of the Fittest backup line, it's only 1 point, which means you can play fast mana, like Mana Crypt and Mox Emerald, and generic good cards like Fourth Air Lingus. What No Good Decisions has done is they have included some of the best mid-range threats that you can get. Lelia, Aragorn, some initiative creatures, Palace Jailer, Seasoned Engineer, Comet and Minskamboo, and ways that basically just force your opponent to respect your fair game plan, and then can sometimes oops, I win combo. The difficulty about playing this versus a strict fair mid-range deck is that you have some cards that are really bad. Corridor Monitor and Pestermite are really not good cards. Even stuff like Prime Speaker Vanifar is really not a very good card. Birthing Pod, when it's being used fairly, is not very strong. Worldly Tutor is card disadvantage, but if you're winning the game, it's all good. I hear winning the game is good. This deck was sort of the top of the meta for maybe 7 years ago in Victoria, and now is just another combo deck. Again, the difficulty is that the gap between the very bad creature combo toolbox pieces and generic mid-range threats has only grown. But this deck has seen some resurgence and some play, especially because there have been a lot of recent depointings that have gotten rid of some of those old cards like Birthing Pod and Survival of the Fittest and lowered them and made them easier to include. Like I said, you could include the Kiki-Pod line into Seekerwalk, and some people have enjoyed that, but this is also perfectly viable as its own separate archetype. Moving on to Pattern Rector. So, Pattern Rector was another archetype that saw a lot of play 6 or 7 years ago, and has sort of struggled to update itself in the modern Commander environment. The way that Pattern Rector typically works is that, much like Flash Hulk, it's a Protean Hulk combo deck. But rather than getting to Protean Hulk through Flash, what you're doing is you're using a sacrifice outlet, such as Viscera Seer, and the card Academy Rector, which when Academy Rector dies, it's a 4-mana 1/2 that when it dies, you can exile it from your graveyard, and if you do, you search your library for an enchantment and put it into play, then you shuffle your library. So you sacrifice your Academy Rector. The way it works is you have a sack outlet, any other creature, and an Academy Rector. You sacrifice the Academy Rector. Academy Rector goes and gets the enchantment Pattern of Rebirth, which enchants a creature. It's an aura, and when that creature dies, their controller can search their library for any creature and put it on the battlefield. So you sacrifice Pattern Rector, or you sacrifice the Academy Rector, which gets Pattern of Rebirth, hence Pattern Rector, enchanting your miscellaneous creature. You sacrifice the miscellaneous creature, which then gets Protean Hulk, and then you sacrifice Protean Hulk, and Protean Hulk goes and gets Samwise Gamgee, Sylvan Safekeeper, Ginger Brute, Cauldron Familiar. It gets a Hulk pile. If you want a description of this Hulk pile, go see the Flash Hulk section of the same video. Because you're not paying 7 points for Flash, you get to have some more points for different tutors, such as Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor. You even get Natural Order, because you can Natural Order into Protean Hulk, as it is a green card. This also gives you the backup plan of Natural Ordering into something like Atraxa, which is just a very powerful, flying Vigilance Death Touch lifelink. You get the bunch of card advantage off of it. The difficulty with this deck is that it plays a lot of... It can play a lot of really bad cards. The Flash Hulk pile, not the Flash Hulk, the Protean Hulk pile itself is a bunch of cards that are not very good. So those take up slots. The sacrifice outlets are not very good. Academy Rector itself is not particularly good. It's just a lot of bad cards to enable the combo, which then makes your general mid-range game plan weaker. You still get to play a lot of hand attack because you're a black deck, unlike the Pod and the Seekerwalk decks. And so you can build your deck to have sort of a level of generic interaction and mid-range stuff, but you are diluting your mid-range game plan by playing a combo. And that combo is not the easiest to assemble because you have to keep a vulnerable sacrifice outlet in play, get a 4-mana 1/2 in play, have another creature in play for the Pattern of Rebirth, and you are vulnerable to Graveyard Hate because when the Academy Rector dies, if your opponent exiles it in response to its trigger, you don't get the Pattern of Rebirth. You're vulnerable to creature removal because if you sacrifice your Academy Rector and someone removes your creatures in response, then you're out of luck. And you're vulnerable to anti-search effects like Opposition Agent or Opposition Agent, which sees a lot of play, or even stuff like Dothy Voidwalker, which sees a lot of play. This deck is a little bit of a relic of the past. It recently put up a result, but it's not really the strongest thing you can do in Highlander anymore. The fair game plan is kind of weak compared to the general power level of the format, and the combo is not fast enough or strong enough to warrant its inclusion. Alright, finally, the last creature combo deck I want to talk about is Cradlehoof. This one was sent in by Deathrite Shaman, who is Spencer on the Victoria Council right now. And Cradlehoof is another combo deck that has sort of been sort of a relic of the past. If you watch Legacy or follow Legacy, you'll know that there are various elf decks, natural order elf decks, Cradle Control decks, and these things either natural order into Atraxa or Cradlehoof Behemoth. And basically the way that the Cradlehoof deck works is it seeks to play a bajillion mana-producing creatures, elves. Most of them are elves, but elves, walls, etc. Things that produce a lot of mana, and then either natural order or otherwise tutor a Cradlehoof Behemoth into play. I mean, this deck produces so much mana that hard casting Cradlehoof Behemoth is not even that far of a stretch. Hard casting an 8 mana creature is not that hard in this deck. The reason this deck is not so great is that you need a lot of creatures in play for Cradlehoof Behemoth to work, which most of these creatures are really vulnerable and they don't do anything. They're just mana creatures. So in a world where Fury and Pyrokinesis exist, or people play Terminus or Balance, it's a hard sell to try and land 4 to 5 mana dorks. And the deck suffers from the classic problem of being a ramp deck where it can draw all ramp and no payoffs. So if you have a hand that's 4 dorks and 0 tutors, you could just draw nothing and die. If your hand is all tutors and no mana dorks, then you're also out of luck. Theoretically, the backup game plan is you make a lot of mana and you cast mid-range threats like Questing Beast, or even some bigger ones like Elder Gargaroth, hard casting Dragonlord Tarka, that sort of thing. But in reality, this type of deck it really struggles in a contemporary Highlander environment because the quality and abundance of removal has increased. The amount of removal that sees play has increased, and the game plan is just too inconsistent and too easily disrupted by things that people already play. But it's a good thing to know about because natural ordering for Cradlehoof or Atraxa is something that is done in a lot of other formats, and this is sort of the combo way of trying to take advantage of natural order. Now that I've talked about creature combo decks, I want to talk about the sort of non-blue mid-range decks. Even though there are decks here that are blue, such as some of the Welder variants, these generally include decks that are not trying to be purely reactive, like stuff like Jeskai or Jeskai Green or Czech are. These are decks that are sort of go back and forth between a proactive or a reactive plan. They generally don't have a ton of counterspells, if any, and they really just try to play either pure good stuff or accrue value through sort of synergy pieces. There's sort of like three categories. There's the good stuff piles. These are things like Atraxa and Taxes, Black-Red Midrange, Jund, artifact-based strategies that are the various Welder strategies and Stax. And then sort of synergy-based strategies are things like Lands Midrange, Martyr Proc, or Aristocrats. These decks tend to use either fast mana, sometimes the best of the best tutors, but usually it's fast mana for these types of decks. Let's look at the lists. So the first list is Atraxa and Taxes by Vast. This deck is an Abzan Hate Bears deck that splashes blue for a few more Hate Bears, such as Leovold, some of the best cards that have been printed, such as Oko and Teferi Time Raveler, but primarily does it so that it can natural order for Atraxa. It is not like a dedicated natural order deck. It's not trying to find natural order really fast. And Atraxa is surprisingly hard castable, even if you don't natural order into it. But it uses natural order as kind of a high roll card, rather than playing like more Moxit, for example. So this one's Mox Emerald, Mox Pearl, natural order, Chain Impact, Jite. Yeah, this deck is basically just trying to play some mana dorks for early acceleration into, hate bears like Collector Oof, Thalia, and sort of the best of the best 3-drop disruptive pieces or engine pieces. So things like Anointed Peacekeeper, Archon of Maria, Leovold, Op Agent. These are all hate pieces. Sentinel, the Nameless City, Exsanguinator Cavalry, White Plume, are strong engine pieces. Things like Palace Jailer and the Initiative top end. Obviously, you get a little bit of hand attack with being in black. There's a one of Reanimate, which is really useful, especially for when you natural order into Atraxa, your opponent kills it with like a Shieldred's Edict or something, and then you reanimate the Atraxa. That's really powerful. It's got a little bit of removal, but this is basically just playing the best good stuff in the Abzan colors with a small blue splash for more hate pieces and design mistakes, as well as natural ordering for Atraxa. This deck is pretty good against stuff like combo decks, but it can be kind of slow to win because it's not playing creatures that are super high impact, even though things like White Plume and the initiative creatures seem like they would win really fast. A lot of the hate bears are creatures that don't have very good combat abilities or are below rate. So, for example, Archon of Maria is a really, really strong and brutal hate piece, but it's also a 2/3 for 3. That's not going to win very quickly. Same with Op Agent. Op Agent's a 3/2 for 3, which is fine, except that, it can't attack into anything with 2 power. So, the deck is it did see quite a bit of play when it was first sort of innovated on, when, people took this innovation of playing an Abzan shell and splashing natural order for Atraxa, and hasn't really seen a whole lot of success since, but it's got, it's a generic mid-range value, so it's going to be pretty hard to say it'll do poorly everywhere, but it definitely needs understanding of what metas you're going into to tune what hate pairs you want to bring, and the 4-color mana base for a non-blue deck can be quite rough, even with mana dorks, because you just don't have the consistency from cantrips to find your different types of lands, and unlike blue decks, which are primarily blue, and then sort of splash everything else, this deck is like pretty heavily Abzan, which means that your color requirements are pretty hefty. But this is one way that you can use sort of a fair natural order to get value out of stuff like Atraxa. Another deck is something like Black-Red Midrange. This one's by Arkanoid. And Black-Red Midrange is a deck that sees a lot of success in something like Pioneer, but is not something you really see as you go further back in formats. I guess you technically had Black-Red Scam until Fury was banned in Modern, but that deck wasn't really a mid-range deck. It was more of just trying to really abuse the Evoke Elementals, which is something you can't really do in 100-card Singleton. But Black-Red Midrange plays, all the best Black-Red threats. It's definitely more proactive than you would expect, simply because you don't have the permission from counterspells and you don't have the density of hand attack to be like super hard control. So you do need to have some sort of pressure to end the game. But it's just a pile of removal and value creatures. Something that Arkanoid has done with his list is that he's included Entomb and a bunch of reanimation spells. So he's got Reanimate, Persist, Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead. So it's sort of like a little mini Reanimator package. This is mostly hitting fair stuff, like you can hit your Shieldrids or your Fury that you evoked, or your Grief, your Oliphant and Troll of Khazad-dûm that you land cycled. But he does have Archon of Cruelty for the sort of little bit of a high roll. And sort of the appeal of playing Black-Red mid-range in Canadian Highlander is that you also get to run the moon effects. So Magus of the Moon and Blood Moon are ways to sort of lock people out of game. Your goal is to just beat them with proactive threats and then really hamper their mana bases. And it's not really so much to lock them as it is to slow them down as the rest of your creatures sort of take over. Another Black-Red mid-range deck that I have here is actually one that I've made, where Arkanoid went for Demonic Tutor Double Mox Mana Vault. I went for Soul Ring Double Mox, and this means that the structure of the deck is a little bit different. I'm opting for more, value 3s and 4 drops that are using Soul Mana, whereas he's a little bit higher on the curve because he wants to sort of spike the Entomb reanimation plan. I'm on a lot more lands, so I guess if we do a compare, let's do a compare. So comparing decks, they're actually quite different from each other, but some of that's just in the mana base, which is sort of whatever. My version has a lot more lands in it, and is focused more on these sort of value 3 and 4 drops, whereas his list has these bigger 5 drops that he's going for because he's trying to, gamble or loot them away and reanimate them. I also have a little bit of a reanimation theme. I've got actual Reanimate and Animate Dead in my version of the list, but I'm not so far as, say, Dance of the Dead or Persist. I am playing Virtue Persistence because it's a removal spell that upgrades later into, like a Portal to Phyrexia type of effect. But they are both the same sort of plan, just trying to use Blood Moons to cause your opponents to stumble, discard, and a little bit of land destruction. Basically disrupt the lands, disrupt the hands, and play solid value creatures and hope it gets there. My version has a little bit of a green splash for Questing Druid and Deathrite Shaman. You don't really ever need green mana in the deck, but because the Questing Druid is mostly used for Seek the Beast. But Black-Red Midrange is A fun deck. I wouldn't call it a super competitive deck because it has some serious weaknesses. It's actually pretty good into combo simply because the combination of hand attack and land disruption with a clock is quite good, but it sort of suffers sometimes against some of the bigger mid-range decks, and obviously you don't have the permission from blue in order to really smooth out your matchups and also smooth out your draws. There's a lot of times where you sort of just draw the wrong parts of your deck, and you know, you just kind of lose because you don't have the tools that you need. You also don't really have removal for things like artifacts or enchantments, which doesn't come up often, but when it does, it's extremely noticeable. Another mid-range deck that you can play is Jund, and this Jund list is from Genghis Prawn, and it chooses to run double Mox, Mox Jet, Mox Ruby, Strip Mine, Tainted Pact. And this is sort of Jund as you would maybe expect from like modern, old modern Jund or Jund Saga. It's basically looking to use really low curve threats and card advantage engines like Dark Confidant and Deep Root Waitfinder, and has a little bit of a land sub-theme because you're trying to use Wrenn and Six and various other land synergies to take good advantage of your Wasteland and your Strip Mine and your Urza Saga to grind out games, grind out advantage. There's crop rotation and traverse the Ulvenwald to go and find your tech lands. This is a very low curve version of Jund. A lot of Jund lists that you might see in Canlander tend to might go higher on the curve to play more initiative creatures, which is also a valid way of playing it. But yeah, Jund is very similar to Black-Red Midrange in that it's basically a pile of removal and value creatures, and you're not like pure aggro because you're not playing a 40 creature deck with burn spells, but you're also not really reactive. You're just trying to remove things and use your creatures for pressure. And playing Jund gives you access to really powerful threats like Grist and Minsk and Boo that you don't get access to when you're in pure Black-Red. So you lose the moons, but you get a lot of other powerful threats, Tarmogoyf, all the classic fair Jund things that you would come to expect. All right, let's move on to the Welder decks. So this Grixis Welder deck by Tim H. Welder basically refers to a sort of subcategory of archetypes that are artifact midrange decks that seek to use various value engines to draw cards, create a lot of bodies, etc. And it's also sort of centered around artifacts. Similar decks might include things like Painter decks in Legacy and 8-cast decks in Legacy, and those all sort of get mishmashed and smushed together into the Welder archetype in Canadian Highlander. You obviously only get one Goblin Welder, one Goblin Engineer, so the Welder is not the main part of the deck, but it is definitely something that is powerful to do, and you get powerful engine pieces like Emery and Sai and Urza, and you're just looping things like, Baubles for more cards, experimental synthesizers. You get Oni Cult Anvil to sacrifice artifacts and drain people and make more artifacts, sort of the Meek-Thopter Foundry. Kind of like how Time Vault had that sort of mid-range plan, where you saw that with Jeskai Time Vault. That's sort of what these Welder decks are looking to do. It's a bunch of really grindy value pieces, but without the combo finish, so that they can use their points on other things. You sometimes will even see things like Painter Servant and Grindstone in these Welder lists. The Grixis Welder list here, gets the top end of like welding in and out of Chaos Defilers, gets Duretti, which is a really powerful board control piece. We're on the Thoughtcast and Thought Monitors and Expressive Iterations for lots of card advantage. You'll notice that even though it's a blue deck, there are no counterspells. It's basically just trying to interact with the board and get lots of card advantage, sometimes hide behind something like an Ensnaring Bridge. Another version of Welder that I was sent to me was this Jeskai Welder by No Good Decisions, rather than Grixis, which gives you the Oni cults and some other removals and hand attack and Shieldred. This Jeskai Welder list is actually 4-color because it's kind of splashing the black, but it's splashing black for Dreddy, Chaos Defiler, and I think Oni Cult Anvil are the only black cards. Let's see. Yep, those are the only black cards because the other ones are all hybrid costs. And the Jeskai list is pretty similar, but instead of black for some of these other cards like Tezzeret and Shieldred, you get white, which gives you things like Teferi Time Raveler, Oswald Fiddlebender, which is sort of like another Welder effect. It lets you, turn your pieces into other pieces, makes your deck more of a toolbox. You get powerful generic initiative threats like White Plume Adventure and Seasoned Engineer. Dig Site Engineer lets you make constructs every time you cast artifact spells. This particular version is using Tinker, Mana Crypt, Tinker, Mana Vault, Tolarian Academy. So it's a little more explosive. It has a bit of a Tinker package. But basically, these lists can be boiled down to use artifact synergies to grind out value. Use artifact synergies to grind out value, and sort of go from there. Yeah, this comparison doesn't help. They're too different from each other. Yeah, you can build this in a variety of colors. Almost all of them include red because the Welders themselves are very good pieces, and you get some cool cards like Ray's Apprentice, Gut, Broadside, Chaos Defiler. Gut's not in this one, but Chaos Defiler, Broadside, Ray's Apprentice. All cards that are designed to kind of give you value engines and ways to pay off value engines. Welder is a decent deck. It's a very cool deck. You feel very busy doing lots of things, and you can make it fairly toolboxy. It tends to suffer sometimes in the face of aggro decks because it takes some time to get set up. When you're casting baubles and other things that don't really do anything, then your opponent just beating you down with aggro creatures is really bad. Sometimes your key engine pieces will get removed, so things like Emery, where the Welders are very vulnerable to removal because they die to literally everything in the format. And it doesn't necessarily have a super fast clock against combo. What the Welder decks are really, really good at doing is they're really good at grinding out blue decks or other really fair mid-range decks because they have way more value engines that just accrue cards and random fodder than other decks do. Alright, that was Welder. Sort of a similar offshoot of Welder is this Mardu Green Stax list that was sent to me by Noah Wick. And this is sort of more of a prison take on the Welder variant. Prison decks are not very popular in Canadian Highlander, and that's partially because you only get one of each prison piece. It's kind of hard to Trinisphere lock someone when you only get one Trinisphere. It's hard to find the Trinisphere. It's hard to Tangle Wire someone when you only get one Tangle Wire. So it's just difficult to find your appropriate Stax pieces and difficult to break parity on them. In Modern Magic design where everything does 5 million things, it's slowing down the game helps, but it doesn't always save the day. But this Mardu Green Stax list sort of turns that on its head and plays a bunch of Stax pieces to pretty good effect. It's got things like Tangle Wire and Trinisphere and Snaring Bridge, Winter Orb, and sort of pairs it with these various value engines like Palantir. It's got Stoneforge for Cauldra. It can take care of the board with Balance and Terminus, but sometimes it'll just kill you with Sir Ginger or Broadside Bombardiers. It's still got the whole welding thing with welding Chaos Defiler in and out. You can just sit behind Stax pieces and pile up a Minsc and Boo token and then throw it. It's a fairly unique list that Noah has had some success with, but this is another way that you can go about building Welder without blue. There's a big temptation to run Tolarian Academy and run blue in your Welder lists, and this list is pretty much maxed out on Soul Mana plus 4th Aerlingus to play sort of a board-based control deck, which is a kind of a unique take in the format, and it's just something I really wanted to show people. This deck is, from my understanding, is pretty good into a lot of fair matchups. It's really well designed to fight the fair decks via tons of removal, tons of value engines and grinding. Even the fair decks really can't fight through Tangle Wires and Winter Orbs super well. They're just designed to operate on a certain level of efficiency, and when you mess with that efficiency, they really struggle. What this deck does suffer against, even though it has some hand attack and some hate pieces, is it really suffers against combo decks, because combo decks can generally just ignore most of the Stax pieces that are being put down. And this deck, while it can have explosive starts, also is not like an aggro deck that is guaranteed to sort of goldfish you on turn 5. Alright, that was Mardu Green Stax. Now let's look at some lands midrange decks. So the first one I want to cover is this Sans Red lands midrange with Natural Order by Bro Gatsby. It's on Demonic Tutor, Strip Mine, Natural Order, Vampire Tutor, Mystical Tutor. And this deck is basically looking to Natural Order for either Atraxa or Primeval Titan, or I guess also sometimes Titania, depending on the situation. And it's really a lot more of a combo deck than a mid-range deck. It's not full-on combo, because it still has, the mid-range value pieces of, various hate bears, white plumage adventurer. It can still sort of give the impression of playing a mid-range game plan, but it is a lot more focused on essentially resolving a natural order to win the game. Go way over the top with Primeval Titan, Atraxa, etc. Through natural order. The blue gets you Oko and Teferi, and some cantrips, as well as some counterspells. This is actually a deck with some counterspells, but it's not the same level of counterspells as stuff like Jeskai or Czech. It's only running, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's only running 7 counterspells instead of like 15. It's just enough to slow down the opponent so that you can go and find your natural order and resolve it, punch a hole with your hand attack, and go way over the top with various land synergy pieces. It's not running some of the traditional lands combo pieces that you would expect, like Zern Orb or Fast Bond, because when you got a 6/6 trample, going and getting Strip Mine and Wasteland, and then having your opponent have to deal with this is usually pretty good. You don't need to go bigger than that. Lands midrange is kind of, it used to be very popular. It's sort of fell by the wayside with the printing of the initiative, because most lands midrange pieces are not very aggressively costed. Your Augur Bottoms of the world and the Raminap Excavators are not even in here, but stuff like Augur Bottom is not very aggressive. It's very bad at fighting against initiative creatures, and initiative really needs you to fight to the board. But this is a way to build lands midrange by going way over the top, and sort of being like a hybrid midrange combo deck. Another way you can build lands midrange, this green-black-white lands midrange deck was made by me, is by leaning more into the lands package, but also leaning more into sort of just fast midrange. So this deck is on Crypt, Emerald, Strip Mine, so lots of fast mana and Strip Mine for disruption. And essentially what this deck does is it tries to accelerate into powerful 3-drops, and has a sprinkling of lands pieces in between. So things like Raminap Excavator that let you play cards from your lands from your yard, Tireless Tracker, which gives you value from playing lands because you get clues, which show you cards, which then grows the tracker. Aranus, which gets you, whenever it attacks, you return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield, but it's also just a Death Toucher. And really it's just looking to abuse fast mana to get pressure into play. And then it has a little bit of a prison element, in that it's running things like Winter Orb and Trinisphere and Sphere of Resistance, because when you're running this many mana dorks plus a bunch of fast mana, you can naturally break the parity on your stuff like your Winter Orb, your Throne of Amethyst, your Trinisphere, your Sphere of Resistance. The reason for running a lands package in this sort of a deck, as opposed to just playing a normal stompy mid-range deck, is that when you're restricting your opponent under taxation effects, taking out their lands can keep them locked under it for longer. This deck is not necessarily focused on making sure people are locked completely under taxation of pieces, but really that it makes them stumble enough that your aggressively costed creatures can take over the game. Yeah, this deck suffers a little bit in that it doesn't run a whole lot of removal. You know, you're running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 5 or 7 pieces of removal. So it can struggle against other fair decks, but it also does really well against the decks that are used to operating under low resources. So things like combo or blue midrange, because taxation effects are really bad against them, but it can suffer against things like Gruul Monsters or other aggro decks. You also could be splashing, instead of splashing white for Knight of the Reliquary, White Bloom, and Season's Engineer, you could be splashing red for things like Renin 6 and Mawloc and Minscamboo. But this is just another way that you can approach the land's midrange shell. Again, this is not really a combo deck because it's not running things like Zernor, but it is running things like Fastbond, because if you get Fastbond plus Crucible plus Strip Mine, that's, you know, spend 5 life to take out all your opponent's lands, sounds pretty good. Yeah, so it's just another way you can look at lands midrange. Okay, let's talk about Martyr Proc. So, Martyr Proc is a bit of a weird deck. It's a sort of mono-white or sometimes black-white synergy deck, I guess is the best way to describe it. And it runs, it's based off of the card Martyr Sands, which is a 1-mana 1/1 that for 1 and reveal X white cards from your hand and sacrificing the Martyr Sands, you gain 3 times X life. And this is typically done with a card that was called Proclamation of Rebirth, which is probably no longer played because it's way too slow, that let you forecast it to rebuy something like Martyr Sands. And the goal is basically just reveal a bunch of cards and gain a bunch of life, and sort of waits a lot of time. This deck is, it's hard to say this, but it's a life gain synergy sort of deck that is really just meant to grind out the game by gumming up the board with creatures that you can constantly bring back and getting a lot of life so that you have a hard time dying to fair decks. You know, it plays this things like Soul Wardens, Call Me a False Hope to prevent combat damage. You know, and even things for combo like Hope of Cure, which when it deals damage to, you can sacrifice it to make somebody who was dealt damage by it not be able to cast non-creature spells until your next turn. So if you can constantly recur this each turn and attack with it and sack it, you can just block people out of casting non-creature spells. You know, it plays some heat pieces, kind of like a Death and Taxes deck, but it's definitely not aggressive like a Death and Taxes deck. And it's really known for having a lot of recursion. So things like Abiding Grace that return creatures with CMC 1 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Lurrus, you'll see things like Lurrus to constantly rebuy things. Order of White Clay, it's a 1/4 that for 3 mana for 1 white and for 1 white and untapping it, you can return a creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's basically just designed to spend a lot of time and be really annoying and grind things out. Fortunately, gaining a lot of life is really useful when you've got something like the One Ring, because the One Ring draws you a bunch of cards, and then if you gain a bunch of life, you offset the downside of the One Ring, which lets you draw more cards, and sort of snowball the game out that way. This particular build by Gold Travesty features the Heliod Walking Ballista combo. So Walking Ballista, it's a 0/0 that for double X enters with X/1/1 counters. You can pay 4 generic to put a 1/1 counter on it, but importantly, you can remove a 1/1 counter from it to deal 1 damage to any target. Heliod Suncrown says whenever you gain life, you put a 1/1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control, and you can give a creature lifelink. So if you have a Ballista in play with 2 counters on it, and you have 2 mana, you give the Walking Ballista lifelink, it shoots your opponent, it gains you life because it has lifelink. Heliod triggers, you put a 1/1 counter back on the Ballista, you have infinite ammo for the Ballista to shoot your opponent. Another version of this deck is was sent to me by QZ Aussie. So this Martyr Proc by Gold Travesty is Soul Ring, Mox Pearl, Strip Mine. This one by QZ Aussie is Soul Ring, Mox Emerald, Mox Pearl. Mox Emerald for the activation of Haywire Might. They are probably pretty similar. Let's run a quick comparison. But the main difference is that the one by QZ Aussie does not run the, they're very similar. It does not run the Heliod combo, and instead just is a normal mid-range plan. I say mid-range, it's like mid-range in really heavy quotes, because calling this a mid-range deck is like, It just doesn't feel right. It's a mid-range, it's a synergy, grindy, mono-white deck. Another way you can build Martyr Proc, this one is black-white by Bleach is with black in it, so this one's Demonic Tutor, Mox Jet, Mox Pearl. And by adding black, you get some more relevant hate pairs, like Opposition Agent, Orchestra Masters. You get some more card advantage with Dark Confidant. You don't care about losing life if you're gaining a million life. If your deck is built around life gain, Dark Confidant doesn't hurt you enough. Shieldred, it's really good. Amalia is pretty neat, is a new one. This Scornblade Berserker is actually pretty neat tech because it's a 1-mana 0/1 with backup 1, where the effect it gives is 1 generic and sacrifice this creature to draw a card. So with a Scornblade Berserker plus an Abiding Grace, that's just another way of drawing a card every turn. Call of the Ring lets you draw a card every turn. You get a little bit of reanimation with Animate Dead. You could even play like a Reanimate. This one doesn't, but you could. Yeah. Basically, the goal of this deck is just grind your opponent out for the long game. These decks are typically kind of bad against combo decks because they don't really apply pressure fast at all. Obviously, they have some hate bears, but combo decks are designed to defeat hate bears up to a certain point. And it can actually be shockingly bad against really fast aggro decks because it takes some time to set up your sort of stall pieces. Call Me a False Hope is great to prevent combat damage once, but if your opponent then shocks it, or whatever, you play your Soul's Attendant or your Soul Warden and your opponent shocks them and then crashes through with Goblin Guides and stuff, you might die really quickly. Yeah, this is not a great deck, but it also is a deck that puts up more results than you would expect. The last sort of mid-range deck I want to talk about is Aristocrats. This one's by Ben Wheeler, and it's on Triple Mox, Tainted Pact. And Aristocrats is essentially a synergy deck that works with having sacrifice outlets like Viscera Seer that can sacrifice creatures for free. At least that's the goal. Sometimes you will see not free sack outlets, but free sack outlets are a huge premium. And then you play a bunch of things that care about stuff dying. So things like Judith the Scourge Diva. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. Zulaport Cutthroat. Whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Blood Artist. Whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And so the goal is you play these sacrifice outlets, you play these things that care about things dying, and then you play a bunch of things that die well. And by die well, I mean that they create more bodies. They're fodder, they're cheap, and they create more bodies when they die. So things like Nested Shambler, when it dies, it makes another squirrel, or maybe more if its power is buffed some way. Young Wolf is undying, it comes back. Brindle Show, when it dies, it makes a 3/3. Bloodghast, it dies, but for landfall, it comes back for free. Goblin Rabble Master creates a bunch of tokens that you can just kill. And this sort of game plan is not very powerful, actually, because a lot of these cards are just really not good. Playing 1/1s for 1, 1/1s for 1, you're just playing like a bunch of really bad cards in the hopes that assembling 3 or 4 synergy pieces in a huge board will work well. Obviously, sometimes this Aristocrats deck can just win out of nowhere because you'll have a board that's like 5 things of nothing plus a Blood Artist, and then you sacrifice your entire board, it all comes back, you sacrifice it again, you drain your opponent for 12. It's not really a combo deck in that sense, but it is a deck that is really good at nickel and diming people. In theory, because it's got so much fodder that Aristocrats doesn't care about, it blanks a lot of removal. Removal is very bad against the deck, but also there are key pieces that you need to make sure stay alive, so removal's okay against the deck. And the creature quality has improved significantly over the last 5-6 years, that these creatures just don't really stand the test of time. It used to be that Aristocrats was really good at fending off the fair decks because it could just chump block forever. You basically just don't die to creature damage. But creatures hit hard enough now that that's no longer the case. Aristocrats is also notably extremely bad against combo decks. It is not a fast deck, and it is not very disruptive, even though it runs things like Hand Attack. Yeah. So this is sort of a relic of the past. It is a really cool idea. Um, and if you really like things like Rakdos Sacrifice or something in Historic or Pioneer, I'm not sure how good those decks are anymore. Um, then this is something kind of up that same in that same vein. And really is a deck that's looking for a way to modernize it for modern Canlander. It's really cool because it's a cool historic deck, not the format, but just historic in the context of Canlander, but has kind of not really stood the test of time. The last category of decks I want to talk about are combo control decks and sort of the other combo decks that didn't fit into the other categories. These decks are looking to control the game for some amount of time and then pivot into a combo finish. So decks like Jeskai Slushie, are looking to control the game for a little bit, but then sort of combo on turns 5 through 7-ish. So that makes them not quite as fast as the pure fast combo decks, but they're also not creature combo, so they're really just playing a control game that pivots to a combo finish. Other decks like Scapeshift or Thoracle Control are willing to play a really hard control game until turns 9, 10, etc., and have a combo finish. And then Lands combo is sort of a little unique in that it's a bunch of synergy pieces, but it's not necessarily blazing fast and is sort of meant to grind, so they're in this category as well. So let's look at lists. So the first list I'm going to talk about is Jeskai Slushie. This Jeskai Slushie list is by Paul Zors, and he had some success with this at some big tournaments. I think Cosmic Games in 2023, he did really well with it. Jeskai Slushie is basically using the Underworld Breach Brain Freeze combo that was explained during the fast combo section, so Underworld Breach plus Brain Freeze plus Lion's Eye Diamond, in order to have a Breach combo finish. That's called Slushie because, Brain Freeze. Drinking a Slushie gives you Brain Freeze. And it looks to set this up via Intuition or Gifts Ungiven, because you can Intuition or Gifts Ungiven for Breach, LED, and Savine's Reclamation. And with enough fuel in your graveyard, you can escape LED a few times to rebuy Intuition to go get Brain Freeze and perform the Brain Freeze combo. But otherwise, it sort of looks like a normal Jeskai control deck. Obviously, because you're including the Breach combo, you don't get to play Ancestral Recall. Instead, you have Underworld Breach and then usually a wide spread. So Paul Zors in this one has Dig Through Time, Gifts, Fourth Aerlingus, Intuition, Mana Drain, Mystical Tutor, and Treasure Cruise. This means that the deck has access to a lot of points to find its combo, but it's not necessarily quite as strong in the normal mid-range game plan because it's lacking Ancestral Recall. But yeah, otherwise this is sort of very similar to a Jeskai mid-range, Jeskai control list that has the ability to pivot into a combo finish. Another list was sent to me by Haru. Haru also sent me a Jeskai Slushie list. This one is using Jace the Perfected Mind as an additional way to do the Slushie combo, because you can do Jace the Perfected Mind plus Breach plus LED, as well as Jace just being a sort of okay value walker. I believe he's also chosen to be on True Name Nemesis over Treasure Cruise, because he wanted to... When you're doing the Breach combo, when you're setting up for the Breach combo, you really want to have fuel for the Breach combo, which means that you're restricted on how much you can tax your graveyard with Delve spells, and the deck already has Murktide Regent and Dig Through Time, putting some stress on the graveyard. Let's just do a quick compare. So the differences are pretty slight, actually. Haru's has Gamble and a few more control pieces, as well as that additional copy of Jace as another way to perform the Breach combo, whereas Paul Zors has a little bit more removal and has Treasure Cruise over the True Name Nemesis. Slushie is it's a pretty interesting deck. I am not sure that it's strictly... I don't think it quite has the same strength as a normal Jeskai control deck, because the Jeskai control deck just is so consistent. And, when you introduce these combo pieces that are dead draws in your control deck, that can be difficult. and also giving up recall is really quite difficult. The control decks really lean on recall for making sure they win the card advantage war. So you're just sort of introducing a level of vulnerability. You're introducing an explosiveness that you get from having a combo in your deck, but you're introducing a little bit of a vulnerability, which can be a positive or a negative depending on the metagame you expect to face. If you expect to face a lot of graveyard hate, then the breach combo doesn't really add to your deck and instead is just creating a new vulnerability for your deck. But if you expect to play against a lot of decks that are really good at grinding but can't really interact with your combo at all, you get this sort of surprise pivot. So that's Jeskai Slushie. Now let's talk about Scapeshift. So the typical Scapeshift that has seen success in recent times is a 5-color Scapeshift list. This one is sent by Pixel, and it's on Demonic Tutor, Vamp Tutor, Dig Through Time, Fourth, Intuition, Mystical Tutor, and Treasure Cruise. It's mostly a Czech control list, so that's 4-color, no white, but it's splashing a few of the white cards to be 5-color just because it gives you really strong effects, and as a deck that is trying to win through Scapeshift, which is a 4-mana sorcery that says sacrifice any number of lands, search your library for that many land cards, put them into play tapped, and shuffle your library. The combo with this is that you get Scapeshift plus a bunch of other mountains. Scapeshift gets Valakut plus a bunch of other mountains. Valakut is a land that enters tapped, and says whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, if you have at least 5 other mountains, you can have Valakut bolt anything. Well, the thing is if you get Valakut plus 6 other mountains at the same time with Scapeshift, they all see each other, and so you get 6 lightning bolts, which is 18 damage, which is lethal in 99% of scenarios, because most people will lose a few life with fetch lands or shock lands, etc. Because you're a deck that plays so many lands, because you're playing a land combo, you're running 40 lands, 39, 40 lands, it's a lot easier to splash colors. You do want enough mountains in order to make the Valakut game plan work, which means that it is more focused on red cards, which means the white is a splash. So I think this list is splashing just Fourth, Terminus, and Omnath. It's not even splashing Source of Plowshares or Leyline Binding, which are other things you can do. The Scapeshift decks really just look to control the game super hard. They're not actually in the business of ramping to a high number of land drops early on. You might see in stuff like Modern, like there's a Scapeshift combo list that actually uses things like Rampant Growth or Nature's Lore. I'm not sure what the Modern card pool is, but uses things that put more lands into play in order to get to the Scapeshift kill faster. In Canadian Highlander, the decks that have had the most success with Scapeshift kills just use Uro, Explore, and Growth Spiral as ways of getting extra lands into play, because they all cantrip. Both Explore and Growth Spiral cantrip, and Uro is obviously an engine unto himself. So yeah, it's basically just a hard control list. Things you might see are, just a bunch of tutors, a bunch of interaction, and really Scapeshift is looking to naturally make its land drops and send its combo turn 7 or later. It's a pretty, I don't want to say it's a slow deck. It is a slow deck. It's not really looking to win the game very quickly. It's a hard control deck. It tends to have trouble against aggro decks, even though it can run quite a few sweepers like Brotherhood's End or Terminus, because its game plan doesn't really incentivize it to fight the board super hard. And my understanding is that it can also have a bit of a rough matchup into very fast combo decks, because it doesn't pressure very well. And if people can get around the counter magic, if you're playing a fast combo deck that doesn't care about the creature removal, and it puts a lot of stress on the Scapeshift deck for having counter spells. Another version of Scapeshift that has been seeing some success recently, and I've actually been told by the dedicated pilots is maybe even better than the 5-color Scapeshift, is actually a Redless Scapeshift list. So this one is also sent in by Pixel, and it's only on 9 points: Demonic Tutor, Vamp, Dig Through Time, Intuition, Mystical Tutor, and Treasure Cruise. And basically what you're using Scapeshift for is, instead of using it to get Valakut, you're using it with Field of the Dead. Field of the Dead is a land that enters the battlefield tapped, And whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you have 7 or more lands with different names, you make a 2/2 black zombie token. And what this means is that if you have 7 lands in play and cast Scapeshift, you get Field of the Dead plus 6 other lands with different names. That gives you 14 power worth of zombies. And it's pretty hard to lose the game. It's a fair dex anyway, if you've got something that produces that much power in one turn. Plus, depending on what you do, you can go and get islands and blue fetch lands to go get Mystic Sanctuary. So, you cast Scapeshift, you get your Field of the Dead zombies. Then the next turn you fetch out Mystic Sanctuary to put Scapeshift back on top of your deck, redraw Scapeshift, Scapeshift again, leaving Field of the Dead into play, get another 12 to 14 power, and go from there. And really, it's pretty hard to lose from that point. Obviously, it takes a turn or two to kill your opponent, but it's pretty inevitable. And the good thing about this is that you don't have to run a whole bunch of mountains. In the 5-color Scapeshift version, you have to run a bunch of mountains just to hit Valakut's condition. And, you don't necessarily want to draw too many mountains because then you might not have enough left in your deck. Some of them are going to be more shocklands that hurt you, or you're going to have to run a lot of triomes that enter the battlefield tapped. Like, this red version has to run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It runs like all of the tapped red triomes, which makes your mana base really slow. And you don't have to do that in the 4-color version that's not trying to win with Valakut. So you trade winning in one turn for winning over the course of a couple turns and better mana. In some metas, Scapeshift is very powerful because it's very difficult to interact with the combo, and also it's an easy-to-find combo that is one card, really. All you need is time. You just need time to make your land drops, and Scapeshift is just one card, so you don't need to assemble a bunch of pieces. And it also makes the game plan extremely compact, because if you're winning with Field of the Dead with Scapeshift, you also could just be making land drops and triggering Field of the Dead naturally, if you need to. It does struggle a little bit into fast metas, but in metas that are looking to slow down and grind, Scapeshift is really powerful. The next list I want to cover is Thoracle Control. This one was sent in by Wonky Wombat. And this is the main other area where you will see Thassa's Oracle other than Doomsday. The Thassa's Oracle combo that this deck takes advantage of is that you play Thassa's Oracle, which basically wins you the game if you have an empty library, and then you cast either Demonic Consultation, which is a 1-mana instant that has you name a card, you exile the top 6 of your library, and then you exile until you hit that card and put it into your hand. The trick is if you name a card that's not in your deck, you exile your entire deck, so play Thassa's Oracle, respond to its trigger, exile your library, win the game. Same with Tainted Pact. Tainted Pact is 1 and a black for an instant that has you exile cards from the top of your library until you choose to stop, or until you hit a duplicate card, a card with the same name as something already exiled. And what this means is you just go until you get your last card in your library. You play a singleton deck even with basic lands, so you can play multiple basic islands, but one has to be snow-covered, for example. And so you use that to exile your library with Thassa's Oracle. And the nice thing is that this is a really compact combo, and it doesn't cost a lot of mana. Thassa's Oracle plus Consultation just costs blue, blue, black. The downside is that it's actually kind of hard to find Thassa's Oracle and Consultation or Tainted Pact, because the only tutors that really find both pieces are sort of generic tutors, and most of the generic tutors are themselves points, and Thassa's Oracle is 7 of your 10 points. And Tainted Pact is also a point, so really Thassa's Oracle plus Tainted Pact is 8 of your 10 points, which doesn't give you a lot of room for the unrestricted tutor, the pointed unrestricted tutors. The way that this deck gets around that is that it plays Gifts Ungiven. Gifts Ungiven lets you search for 4 cards with different names. Your opponent chooses 2 of them to put into your graveyard, and the other 2 go into your hand. So what this means is you search up Thassa's Oracle, Snapcaster Mage, Reanimate, and Demonic Consultation. And this means this lets you win with 5 mana, because if your opponent gives you the most mana-intensive line, it is Snapcaster Mage plus Thassa's Oracle to hand, which means that you have to play blue-blue for Thassa's Oracle, blue and 1 for Snapcaster Mage, and then flashback Demonic Consultation for black, which is 5 mana total, 1 triple blue black, to win the game. And it's all packed into a 1-card combo of Gifts Ungiven, which is found with Mystical Tutor, or stuff like Solve the Equation. And otherwise, you're just playing sort of a hard control deck. There's a little bit of Transmute 2s, because the Transmute 2s find different parts of the Thoracle combo. They find Thassa's Oracle or Tainted Pact. Yeah, there's not much else to say. It's a very hard control deck that seeks to win mostly with Thassa's Oracle combo. Obviously, sometimes you can win with backup like Jace Wield of Mysteries or beating down with a Murktide Regent, but you're a lot more all-in on ending the game with a combo than you are with the mid-range backup plan compared to something like a Jeskai deck. Like even the Jeskai Slushie deck has higher impact walkers if they want to try to win the game without their combo. Thoracle Control has actually seen sort of a decline in play because it doesn't, when you're playing in Sultai or Esper, these sort of wedges, you don't get access to some of the most busted mid-range threats that have been printed. And as I've said, the Thassa's Oracle combo is very hard to assemble. Even assembling it with Gifts Ungiven has some of its weaknesses, because one of the main selling points of playing Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation or Tainted Pact is that it's very hard to interact with. You basically need counterspells or stifles or a way to shuffle somebody's library somebody's graveyard back into their library. It's very hard to interact with the Thassa's Oracle win con. But when you have Gifts Ungiven, then you introduce a graveyard vulnerability, because to assemble the Gifts Ungiven pile, you need to use your graveyard. So if somebody has something like a Scavenging Ooze or a Cling to Dust, it all falls apart. You also just don't have that great of a backup fair game plan. So this Thoracle Control has kind of fallen by the wayside. It's not that it's not strong, but it's just not... It's not that it can't take games, it's just not as fast as it needs to be, as Canadian Highlander has gotten a lot faster since the printing of the initiative and design, like Lord of the Rings design, basically. Yeah, so I personally would not recommend Thoracle Control, but it is a fairly solid pick if you know what you're going to face, because you need to know what you need to counter, what you need to hand attack, and if you're going into a meta that is very bad at interacting with the Thoracle combo, it can be quite strong. The last category of combo decks I want to talk about are lands combo decks. Lands combo used to be quite popular, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but it's sort of fallen by the wayside because lands typically likes to interact with your opponent's mana and doesn't really fight to the board, and that has become more difficult in a world with stuff such as the Initiative or Fourth Aerlingus. The Initiative and Monarchy really incentivize playing to the board. So lands combo doesn't really have a very solidified stock list, so these two lists are very personal. This list is a 5-color Time Walk lands combo list by Violet Eventide. She's on Time Walk, Strip Mine, and Gifts Ungiven. And basically, you seek to use either lands pieces like Courser, Prefix, Ramanap Excavator, Crucible of Worlds, and Fast Bond in order to do Strip Mine loops. So you do things like Fast Bond plus Crucible of Worlds plus Strip Mine lets you play Strip Mine out of your yard as many times as you want for 1 damage per iteration to strip away all of your opponent's lands. If you have something like Glacial Chasm reduces the damage that would be dealt to you to 0. Fast Bond deals damage to you, so this means that you can play as many lands as you want per turn without Fast Bond hurting you. Course of Prefix also gains you life, so that also offsets Fast Bond damage and lets you play lands off the top of your library, so you can just start ripping through your deck by playing as many lands as you want off the top of your library. You've also got, much like Scapeshift, you've got things like Field of the Dead in order to create tons and tons of zombies. You can grind with things like Urza Saga to put a lot of constructs into play. Things like Valakut Exploration plus Fast Bond are really good because Valakut Exploration has the landfall ability. Whenever a land enters battlefield under your control, you exile the top card of your library, and you can play that until end of turn. And you can play it as long as it remains exiled, but at the beginning of your end step, you put any cards that are still exiled with it into your graveyard and deal damage equal to the number of cards put into the graveyard this way to your opponent. So with Fast Bond, you play a land, exile the top card of your library. If that card is a land, you play that land, exile the top card of your library. And you can keep doing this, and fetch lands count for 2 for Valakut Exploration. So this just keeps exiling cards from the top of your library to either draw you into more ways to do combo pieces, or you can eventually exile enough cards to just let them all go away into your graveyard at the end of turn and dome your opponent for, a large number. Cards like Zurin Orb with Fast Bond and Crucible let you sacrifice lands to gain life, which offsets Fast Bond damage, but you can tap the land in between, which means you can have infinite mana. When you've got things like Horizon Canopy and Crucible and Fast Bond, you can play out lands, crack them to draw cards to draw your deck. But the unique part of this list, besides playing sort of the best mid-range threats, Minsc, Comet, Omnath, etc., is that, and obviously the lands top ends like Primeval Titan, who can search for lands, Titania, who works really well with strip mines and fetch lands, and Zurin Orb, because it creates a bunch of elementals whenever you have a land go to the graveyard, is that it has Time Walk in it. And with Time Walk, you take an extra turn for just 2 mana, and if you have any way of getting Mystic Sanctuary, you play Mystic Sanctuary to put Time Walk back on top. If you've got ways to play lands out of your graveyard and ways to sacrifice your Mystic Sanctuary, either by strip mining yourself or wastelanding yourself, or with Zurin Orb, you can get Time Walk, cast it, replay, get rid of your Mystic Sanctuary somehow, replay it from your graveyard, put Time Walk back on top to take infinite turns, and then obviously infinite turns with all the other stuff that's going on is going to be lethal. This deck is sort of I don't know how best to describe it. It's sort of a hodgepodge of combo pieces, in the same way that a deck like Paradox Academy is really just seeking to leverage the fact that there's a bunch of 3 and 4 card combos with artifacts lying around. This deck is seeking to leverage the fact that there's a bunch of 3 or 4 card lands combos that you can leverage, and you just sort of draw into, and you can tutor some of them, and you just sort of hope to assemble them to go way over the top of your opponent. This is a very personal list, so I have no idea how to rank it in terms of meta viability, but it's one way that you can go about building lands combo. Another way that you can go about building lands combo is this Bug White Lands Control by Nick Eisen. He's opted for, or they've opted for, Demonic Tutor, Strip Mine, Vamp Tutor, Gifts and Given, Intuition, and Mystical Tutor, and their deck is much more of a control deck rather than just being a bunch of overlapping combo pieces and hoping to assemble something. It's a lot more targeted, usually going through things like Intuition and Gifts Ungiven. So some examples are with Intuition, you can go and get Light from the Loam, which is a sorcery that lets you return up to 3 land cards from your graveyard to your hand, but it has Dredge 3, so if it's in your graveyard, instead of drawing a card, you can mill 3 and then put Light from the Loam back in your hand. You can go and get Uro, it's just a crazy card. He gives you extra land drops and can be escaped from your graveyard. And then you can go and get things like Urza Saga or Strip Mine, and this lets you sort of have this grindy value engine that you can dredge Loam to go get back lands, then take out your opponent's lands or make more constructs, and Uro gives you extra land drops, so you're breaking parity, you're not just going 1 for 1, you're getting ahead on lands while you're doing this. Intuition can also do things like get Atraxa, Grand Unifier, from the Catacombs, and Faithful Mending, because Atraxa is a 7/7 Flying Vigilance Deathtouch lifelink, and battlefield, you reveal the top 10 of your library, and for each card type, you can put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand. So it's this giant beater that draws you a bunch of cards, essentially. From the Catacombs is a reanimation spell that you can escape from your graveyard, so it doesn't matter whether it's in your hand or your graveyard from Intuition. And Faithful Mending lets you loot away cards, whether Faithful Mending is in your hand or by flashing it back. So that's another combo you can do with Intuition. You can also do things like get Dark Depths and Thespian Stage. So Dark Depths is a legendary land that enters with 10 ice counters on it, and you can pay 3 to remove an ice counter from it. And when it has no ice counters on it, you sacrifice it and make a 20/20 indestructible flying avatar creature named Merit Lage. The way that this works with Thespian Stage is that Thespian Stage is a land that can tap for colorless, or for 2 and tap it, it can become a copy of a target land, except it has the copying ability. And what this means is that you turn Thespian Stage into a copy of Dark Depths, and this Thespian Stage, because it didn't enter as Dark Depths, has no ice counters on it. Dark Depths is legendary, so you legend rule to keep the Thespian Stage copy. And then Thespian Stage says, I'm a Dark Depths that has no ice counters on it, and so it sacrifices itself to make Merit Lage, the 2020 avatar. And when you've got Savine's Reclamation with Intuition, you can flash back to get all the pieces of the Dark Depths combo. You can also do things with Gifts Ungiven, sort of all the same things that you can do with Intuition, but you get an extra card. So with Gifts Ungiven, you can choose to only search for 2 cards, so you can just go and get from the Catacombs plus Atraxa. You don't have to go through the middleman of Faithful Mending. You can also go and get Savine's Reclamation plus Zurin Orb and Fast Bond and Crucible Worlds, because Savine's Reclamation, you're always going to get at least 2 of these, and Savine's Reclamation can get you the others. Fast Bond, Crucible, and Zurin Orb gets you infinite mana and infinite life. And like in the other deck that I was explaining, you can do all sorts of strip mine loops and all kinds of weird, crazy stuff. Yeah, and you can also do things like do the Gifts Ungiven and do sort of like a hybrid pile with Uro and Atraxa, so you can get Uro, Atraxa from the Catacombs and Faithful Mending, because you're going to get 2 of these. So if you're given Uro and Atraxa, you can Faithful Mending to put them into your graveyard. Uro can be escaped by himself. From the Catacombs can go and get Atraxa back. Basically, this deck is just trying to play a much heavier control role, because it's got things like counter spells and board wipes and a bunch of spot removal, but also have a bunch of combo pieces sort of tucked in, and a lot of it tied together via Gifts Ungiven and Intuition. Yeah, this deck has done pretty well. Nick Heisen has had some success with this on the Discord. I'm not quite sure what the good matchups versus the bad matchups are. My understanding is that this deck, like most lands lists, it struggles to fight to the board, but also at the same time, it has a bunch of things that go way over the top. So if your opponent isn't killing you early, you're going to go way over to the top of them. And because this deck has a lot more counter magic, it's probably a little bit better against combo decks. But this is just another way that you can build sort of a lands combo control list. And I thought it was worth showing to everyone. So that was all the lists that I wanted to talk about today. I just want to give a huge shout out to the Canadian Highlander Discord. I put out the call for lists, and within about 2 weeks, I got 62 different lists from 44 different contributors across 39 archetypes. Everybody was great. They were super willing to share lists and give me stuff that I could use to give this video to you guys. Some people even went and updated their lists so that they would have a more up-to-date version, and that was super awesome. I'm super grateful for that. So if you ever have any questions about these lists, you can always go to the Canadian Highlander Discord and ask about them. People are super willing to share. They're always happy to talk about lists and, talk about different cards and everything. Another place you can check out is the Canlander Winners Archive Moxfield page. This is a Moxfield page that I maintain, which sort of keeps track of winning lists across different events in Canadian Highlander. Most of the events are from the Discord events, but I do get some from local weeklies. So if you ever want to see what's taking down events, try and get an idea of winning lists, that's a good place to go. Another good place to go is the Canlander Database Moxfield page. That Moxfield page has a lot of very good stock lists for both people new to the format and veterans looking to pick up an archetype. Pretty much if you pick up a list from there, it might not have specific meta tech pieces, but it should be very solid. And then also, I'm going to link the Google Sheets that has the links to all the lists that you see in this video, as well as live links to the original lists from the contributors that I got the list from. So if you're watching this video well after its airing date, there might be new cards that come out. I recommend checking out the live lists and checking out the live profiles to see the new hot tech. All these links will be in the video description below. I will also link this Google Slides in the video description below so that you guys have access to this. And I just wanted to really showcase sort of the breadth of Canadian Highlander. I think Canadian Highlander is an awesome format. It's like a brewer's paradise. You can do pretty much anything in it. And I hope that this video gave some inspiration and showed, just how cool our format is. Thank you for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed my talking about Canadian Highlander for several hours, and that you found the video interesting and informative. If you have any questions about lists or comments about what appeared in this video today, feel free to leave them in the comment section below or to tag me on the Discord at Cyclops8. If you want to watch more long-form theory content, you can check out my theory playlist on the left. And if you want to see the format in action, you can check out my gameplay playlist on the right. Thank you for watching the video again. Have a great day. See you next time.